Welcome to the Freeborn Podcast. I'm Mike Jackson, your host, and I'm here with a very good friend from a long, long time, Joshua Kennell from Revive House Messiah. Of Messiah? Of Messiah, excuse me. Revive House of Messiah, minister there. And we've been friends for many, many years. And we're here, we're going to talk about a study that he did recently in the book of Genesis that I've listened to almost all of it. I listened to it mainly at work, and so...
Sounds good.
But I've listened to a lot of it.
Thank you.
And you can find that study. I'll be putting the links to it on our YouTube video and on our podcast show notes so people can find it.
Awesome.
By clicking. But it's on SoundCloud. And you can find it if you want to look for it right now and listen to him exclusively rather than me, which might not be a bad idea. You can find it by typing in Joshua Kennell, all one word, because there's actually a lot of Joshua Kennells on SoundCloud.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I tried it. That's why I finally asked you where it was.
Type in Joshua Kennell and maybe Genesis study, and it'll come up.
There's also several of those, I think.
All right. Well then.
I had a hard time finding it until I typed. So all one word, Joshua Kennell. And then, like I say, I'll put the link on the show notes so you can go and look at it. There's a lot of hours there. A lot of work been put into that.
About 30 some odd hours of teaching through the book of Genesis.
I think it's more than that.
Yeah. About 36 hours.
Is
I
it?
think.
Yeah, it's a good amount. Yeah. Okay. So I want to get this. I know some people are maybe thinking that we're going to talk about the law, and I would like to at another time.
Sure.
Because you brought this up and said you would want to talk about it, and I went and looked at it, and listened to it, and it seems to me that there's enough here that I don't want to shortchange you and your ideas on this, and try to rush through it.
Okay.
So we'll plan another one where we can talk about other subjects,
That'll
maybe
work.
even some translations, which we were talking about a minute ago. So we'll make time to do other things. I'm just letting our audience know because they may think that's what this will be about, and it's not. We're not going to deal with that, at least probably not any way head on. Let me go through and give you a few pros, things I thought you did very well on, and then try to give you your argument overall. Okay. So that you can tell me if I've understood what I've listened to.
Sounds
and
good
then
to me.
you take the floor and make your case.
Sure.
So I'm not trying to steal your thunder.
Okay.
But I want to see if I've understood it.
Yeah,
And you can tell me yes or no. Don't be afraid to say you're stupid. I get that from my wife every day. So I'm good. I'm
Strong.
Yes, I'm strong for that. I'm strong. I can take it.
Tough hide.
Yes. Okay. So a few things I think that I think are very positive on this. First off, I want to let everyone know that's listening, you're a very gifted speaker. And I mean that, and I don't hand out that compliment lightly. Very gifted speaker. I think you go on and listen to it. He'll go, I say go on, it's not the right word, I don't mean to say it that way. He'll go for 3 hours on a portion of scripture, and even if I don't agree, or if the subject matter isn't interesting to me, you're interesting, which is an amazing gift. I think it's wonderful, and I'm glad you're using that as to serve God, and so that to me is a huge plus. I often say in my preaching classes that it's a worse sin to be boring than to be wrong, and you certainly never commit that sin. So that's good.
Thank you.
Yes.
That's a good thing.
It is a good thing. It is. It absolutely is. I mean that in all sincerity. I'm amazed at the gift that you brought to the table on that subject. So
Thank you,
that's
Michael.
very good. And another thing I thought was very positive was I think you show a desire that is often lost in Christianity today of taking the Old Testament seriously. And I don't mean that they think it's a joke. I just don't think it's given its due consideration by many not all. I'm not trying to paint with a broad brush, but mainly in our circles, right? It just seems like a lot of times the Old Testament is not treated as seriously as the New, and I think that you do a good job at taking it very seriously. So I think that was very good also. And then two specific things, and then I'll give you my argument, and you take the floor. So I really liked your comments on Genesis 49. Now, that's not the only one, but those stuck out to me because I kind of listened to them out of order. I don't know if that's allowed, but I did.
You do whatever you want to.
Okay.
I'm just happy somebody's listening to it.
So I sort of listened to them a little out of order, some of them, and so that's why. But 49, you made and I'm not going to get into it. People should go and listen to it, and it's almost the last ones because your last ones were Noah, but the last
they were out of order.
They were. That's why I thought it was allowed.
Yeah, they were out of order. I put them out of order intentionally.
Okay, so the 49 are like the next to the last ones on Genesis 49, which is the blessings and curse, or the blessings that that Jacob gives his sons, right? And I really like the comments on Shiloh. I found those to be very, very interesting and very enlightening. So I'm not going to go much more into that.
Sure.
But the key word is until Shiloh, right?
Yes, sir.
Until Shiloh. I like that a lot.
Awesome.
That was really cool. I enjoyed that. And then I really like the comments on the Jacob portion when he's younger and he's wrestling the angels about wrestling with himself.
Yeah.
Right. And I won't go much more into that. But I thought that was very, very intriguing. I thought that was very interesting way of looking at it. And so I enjoyed thinking about that day and kind of seeing where you're going with that. So those are two things that I really liked in the study.
Cool.
It's not the only things, I want to be clear, but those really stood out to me of the portions that I've heard. Okay. And I have some things I want to go through later on things that I think you've missed the mark, but I want to wait and I want you to make your case.
Sure.
On this first, okay? So I'm going to hold off on all that. But I do want to try to give you a steel man argument of what you're trying to say. And you tell me if I'm fair, if you think, even if it's not exactly how you would say it, if it's close to what you're trying to say.
Okay.
So I'm going to read it to you because since it's not my argument necessarily, I can't do it out of memory. But here's what I wrote down. Okay. Genesis, and arguably all of the scriptures, is a constant and consistent iteration of the same narrative of God and man and sin and redemption as found originally in the Genesis story of creation, the garden, and the fall. Only by layering all of these iterations on top of each other and peering down through them, as it were through a literary palimpsest, can we fully comprehend the whole story that God is revealing to us.
I think that I don't know the word palimpsest.
Palimpsest.
Okay, what's this word?
Okay, that is a manuscript.
Okay.
Technically, there's two ways of looking. One is the metaphorical, as I'm using it, and the other is a technical. Technically, a palimpsest is a manuscript where you like scrape off what's there, and you write a new manuscript on top. You reuse the paper, right? But you can still see. It's only a palimpsest when you can still read the writing underneath it.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
And so they'll do it. Sometimes you'll have several layers of that. And so that's what it is technically. And then metaphorically, it's used as being like kind of like drafting paper, where you can like make a part of a drawing and then lay the next onion paper on top and another part. And when you lay them all, stack them all up, and you can flip through and only see portions. But when you get them all stacked up and look through all of them as layers, you see a full picture.
Okay. Yeah. Then yeah, that's pretty much what I think I was trying to get across. And again, I see it in a lot of different places in the Bible that there's a parallel of the Genesis chapter 3 story. And so in the Genesis study, what I was doing was trying to show that really Genesis 3 is reiterated over and over again in the book of Genesis. As I expanded and looked in other places of the Torah, I saw it in the book of Exodus. I could see it in the structure of the book of Leviticus. Later on, in just normal Bible reading, I went through the book of 1 Samuel. I saw it a dozen times there. And then I see it clearly in the Gospels, and I see the Gospels and what Christ is doing in the garden with the tree at the end, all leaning back or depending upon the Genesis 3 story. So I would say, yeah, it goes through all Scripture. Genesis, I'm fairly convinced it's in every major story that you come across. You can show that there's a verbal literary pattern that follows Genesis chapter 3 pretty faithfully in every story that
now,
you
is it Genesis 3 or is it Genesis 1, 2, and 3?
It's more. What I focus on a lot of the times is that the stories later on just echo the early stories. So my shorthand is Genesis chapter 3. Okay. But in some stories, it expands out, and I can show you that there's, for instance, in the Noah story. I can show you that the Noah story, beginning at chapter 8, follows the same pattern as Genesis chapter 1. And so you can basically read them in parallel. You can find a day 1 parallel, a day 2 parallel, a day 3, going all the way to the fall of man. All of those chapters are paralleled, from chapter 8 of Genesis to chapter 9. And then, looking once again, Genesis 1 through 3. These stories can be read completely in parallel. Other parts, the Abraham story, I can show you begins in Genesis, goes through the Cain and Abel story, goes all the way to the Tower of Babel before this little iteration stops. And then it picks up again with a Genesis chapter 3 story, starting the story over. So sometimes it expands out for I would say a larger chunk of the beginning book of Genesis and picks up on those themes. And other times I would say, no, what you're looking at right here is pretty much the Genesis 3 story repeated in this narrative with maybe the character Abraham, or right here, the Genesis 3 story repeated with Jacob, or the Genesis 3 story repeated with Judah, or so on and so forth.
Okay. So now why don't you tell me, because I gave you kind of my, which I think is pretty spot on to what you're saying. I think I understood your point, but I would like for you to tell me in your words, how would I put it? Tell me in your words what exactly is being repeated without saying, the shorthand Genesis 3. Give me the highlights of the story that you find in iteration.
Sure.
Just like the bullet points.
I got you. So basically, and maybe it'd be interesting just to mention how I came across this.
Absolutely. Go for it.
So I would do a lot of teaching, for the past few years with the different churches that I've been a part of, and a lot of the movement that I'm in now, we focus and we at least go through what's called the Torah portions, which is just like a cyclical annual reading of the Pentateuch, the books of Moses. And so I've gone through it a lot of times, gone through it mostly in English. I did a little bit of Hebrew study in college, and even before college, I started, dabbling in the Hebrew language and having fun with it and looking at it and using it. But it had been a little while since I had seriously done it. And so since we were starting a new cycle of the Torah portions, I thought, you know what, this time I'm just going to go headlong into it. I'm going to read every single word of the book of Genesis in Hebrew as I'm going through it and teaching it, just as a way to increase my knowledge of the language and build it up. So what had happened was I had started teaching through the book of Genesis, and it was when I got to about chapter 12 that I saw, because as you're doing this, you're going over words and you're saying, what's this word? I need to look this word up. And I look it up. But all of a sudden, I'm not having to look up any of the words because I've already seen all these words over and over again. And since I'm reading very slowly, I'm noticing these words are occurring in exactly the same order in each of these stories. Like, oh, there's that word there. So about chapter 12 with Abraham, I noticed this is a direct parallel of the Genesis 3 story. And so now I'll point out some of the words that you see over and over again. And I pointed out in the Noah study, which is why I wanted people to listen to it, that...
Let me interject real quick.
Go.
That what you recommend is that they listen to the Noach is the name of the actual sound
it's
audio.
How you pronounce Noah
Correct.
in Hebrew.
Correct. The Noach file, which is the Noah story first.
Yeah.
Which it was a good summary of.
And the reason I said that is because, like I said, I didn't really discover this pattern until I was in about chapter 12 and teaching. And then from 12 on, I taught it as a hypothesis. I was going through and I said, I noticed this. I wonder if we're going to see this in every one of them. And so the people that were a part of the Bible study, I said, this is what I'm looking for, and this is what I speculate is the case, that all of these stories have this, because I had already seen it, repeated a few different times. So I was like, hey, let's do this. So the Bible study is not me having it all figured out from the beginning. It's me going through and being amazed at how many times I saw this verbal linguistic structure repeated, and then also juggling the idea of what is the meaning of it? Why does this keep, so the study has, I'd say a literary element that I think I make a stronger case for, that, hey, this pattern does reoccur and it's there, and it has a speculative, portion where I'm trying to grapple with what it means. But okay,
fair enough.
So getting back into Genesis chapter 3. So some of the main ideas that I was looking for being repeated, and again, not every story has all of these ideas, but all of the stories have these ideas, and generally in the same order. So what are they? You might find death and life. Because it begins with, at the very beginning, life and death. So I'm looking for life and death in each one of these stories. I'm going to say all the words that I have highlighted.
Okay.
And again, they're not in every story, but all of the story contains these. So serpent, subtle. Look for something that's in the midst of something else. Some of the main ones that were some of the dead giveaways that I saw at the very beginning was the idea of eating, touching something, the idea of knowledge, right? Look for in the story somebody's eyes being opened. The phrase good and evil is a dead giveaway. You really want to look for a character who, this is another one, who sees something, right? And who tries to take it and either eat it or take it. And then sometimes in the iterations of the story, it's a sexual relationship. It happens a lot with the women in the Bible, whether you're talking about Sarah or Rebecca or Joseph, or so you'll see it there. People all of a sudden becoming naked, somebody hearing a voice, right? Somebody hiding. Then I found this over and over again too, this expression where somebody, and I'm looking in Genesis 3:9, where it said the Lord God called unto Adam and said unto him, and then asked a question. That happened in quite a few of the stories in the same order. Somebody calls, says, and then asks a question. Then the idea of a voice, the idea of fear, once again, nakedness, who told you, this question that gets asked quite a few times, what is this that you have done? Somebody being beguiled, like the Jacob narratives come to mind. The idea of curse, the idea of seed, right? And again, I'm just moving through Genesis chapter 3. So you can see
fine.
this. The idea of head, heel, sorrow, whether it be, women and their children and the struggles that they have with them, whether you're looking at Cain and Abel, whether you're looking at Jacob and Esau, whether you're looking at, it doesn't matter, Ishmael and Isaac, all of the stories end up repeating. Joseph and his brothers, hearkening unto the voice, a lot of them. Coats of skin, clothing at the very end. Finally, somebody being sent out of the garden. The idea of a sword, and that may be a good summary. But again, really, what I would suggest if you really want to do this is just devour Genesis chapter 3 and become super familiar with every single word of this story and concept that's in there, and then move into the next story and say, where do I see these concepts repeated?
Okay, why don't you give us an example of what you think is the strongest example that someone could then just take and look at those and try to see where you're coming from and make that comparison. So just give us a somewhat brief. It doesn't have to be super. This is long format.
Yeah.
But give us an example of this happening in somewhere outside 3.
Perfect. So we had kind of talked about different things that we could go through and look at, and I had kind of suggested, and again, I won't go too long into each one of these, but just to give you an idea of where we see it, I'd like to look at a story in Noah, with Noah's life. I'd like to look at and show you how it repeats a few different times in the Abraham story, and then Joseph at the very end.
Well, let's do Noah and see where we get.
Absolutely. And, ask questions or whatever.
No, I will.
So this is in Genesis chapter 9, and what you're going to find here is, I'm starting in Genesis 9:20. And so I'm just going to read some of these words and ask the listeners to think about how this parallels the early story with Adam. So once again, what's the context? Genesis 9 is after the flood, right? It's a brand new world. And if you go through and look at it, you'll see that it's actually a recreation of the world. And so what do you have? You have one family on the earth once again, just like Adam in the beginning. And so Adam was placed into a garden, and Noah is going to be in a vineyard, So there's a parallel between the garden and the vineyard. What does it say? It says, and Noah began to be a husbandman, and he planted a vineyard. That expression goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 2, where God began, right? And what he does is he plants a garden. And so there's the initial parallel. So Noah is playing two different roles in this story. If you look at it carefully, Noah on one hand plays an Adam role on some of the verses, and on the other hand, he's playing the role that God does. So Noah begins, he plants a vineyard, and then what is he going to do? He's going to drink of the wine, and he was drunken. So in the beginning, we have Adam and Eve, and what do? They eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and then it says they noticed that they were, I'm going to leave a lot of blanks because this is how I like to teach. So what did they notice after they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good? That they were naked. And so what does Noah do? He drinks from the wine, and all of a sudden he's uncovered within his tent. And all of these are clues to me. So for instance, if it uses the word tent, right? Tent is going to equal garden later on. And this is helpful because then when you move into the tabernacle and you're looking at the tent, you'll realize that the tabernacle is full of garden symbolism in it. So these are the little things that I was picking up on as I was studying. So he drinks of the wine, he's drunken, which is kind of a consciousness shifting sort of thing, just like Adam and Eve. Their eyes are opened, they become naked. Right here, he becomes uncovered within his tent. It says in Ham, the father of Canaan, he saw the nakedness of his father. Right? In the beginning, it says that the woman saw that the tree was good for food. And so this is one of the verbs that I was seeing over and over again. And it says, and he went and he told his two brethren without. So the word told right there is another one of these words, because God comes down to Adam and Eve and asks the question. He said, who told you that you were naked? And so once again, we have a character, Ham, right here, who is really playing the serpent role in this story. He ends up being the one telling his brothers Shem and Japheth that they're naked, just like God comes down and asks, who told you that you were naked? It says, and Shem and Japheth, they took a garment and they laid it upon their shoulders, and they went backward and they covered the nakedness of their father, and their faces were backward, and they saw not their father's nakedness. So what do we see right here? At the end of the Genesis story, sorry, hit the mic.
No, that's right.
At the end of the Genesis story, God is the one who comes down and ends up covering their nakedness. Also, Adam and Eve attempt to cover their nakedness with fig leaves. So again, another parallel. And it says, and Noah awoke from his wine, and he knew what his son had done to him. So the idea of somebody waking up, right? When you're asleep, your eyes are closed, right? And so when you wake up, you open your eyes, and it says, and their eyes were opened, so that's another parallel. So he wakes from his wine, and he knew what his son had done to him. And again, that's the Hebrew words asa, it's the idea of doing something. God comes down and he says, what is it that you have done? He asks that question. And then you're going to find that Noah begins to curse, and Noah curses Canaan, right? Which, what did God do in the story? He ends up cursing the serpent, and then you have blessing and so on and so forth. So cursing and blessing. So that's just a few examples in the Noah story where I'd say, one or two parallels makes me say, maybe it's connected. 9 or 10 parallels to the story, I say, okay, it's a little bit more than coincidence to me. So that's the Noah story.
All right.
So what about Abraham? Let's see if we can find some of it. If you go to Genesis chapter 12, you'll see. I'm going to start in verse 11. It says, and it came to pass when he had come near to enter into Egypt that he said unto Sarai his wife, behold, I know, again, so looking for the idea of like knowledge, like the knowledge of good and evil. He says, I know that you're a fair woman to look upon. So whereas the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the beginning was what caught the woman's eye and made her desire it and want to take it. Here you have Abraham saying to Sarah, in this story you're reading it, Sarah's like the tree. Okay, like the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So he says, I know you're a fair woman to look upon. So let's see if characters all of a sudden see how beautiful she is, and want to take her. So it says, therefore it shall come to pass when the Egyptians shall see thee, that they shall say, this is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will save thee alive. And again, there's other parallels too, in that we have a husband and wife in these stories. So what's going to happen next? Verse 13. He says, say, I pray thee, that you are my sister, that it may be, and in this translation it says well with me, but it's the Hebrew word good, that it would be good with me, so I'm looking for good and evil, and that my soul shall live because of you. And it came to pass when Abraham was come unto the Egyptians, that the Egyptians beheld, it's the same word look, right? That they looked and they saw the woman, that she was very fair, just like Eve sees the fruit, that it was good to look at. And it says, and the princes also of Pharaoh saw her and commended her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken, again, just like the woman saw that the tree was good for food, or saw that it was, had the ability to make one wise, and she took it. So now Pharaoh's princes, they see Sarah and they take her. And it says that he entreated Abraham well. Once again, it's your Hebrew word good, tov. Abraham was entreated well for her sake. And he had sheep and oxen and asses and men servants and maid servants, she asses and camels. And the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abraham's wife. So the idea of plagues, I think, could be associated with cursing, but clearly it's a foreshadowing of when God is going to plague Pharaoh in the book of Exodus later on. So that I think that's happening. And so then here we go. Here we're getting into this little series right here. It's going to say, and Pharaoh called unto Abraham and said, what is this that thou hast done unto me? Why didn't you tell me that she was your wife? So, just like, and God called unto him and said, where are you? Right? Now you have Pharaoh calling unto Abraham and asking the question, why didn't you tell me? So again, somebody saying, somebody calling, somebody asking a question. Again, in exact same order. Why didn't you tell me that she was your wife? Again, who told you that you were naked? Verse 19. Why saidest thou, she is my sister, so that I may have taken her to me for wife? Now, therefore, behold thy wife, take her, go thy way. And it says, and Pharaoh commanded, which is one of these words that God uses in Genesis chapter 3. Have you eaten from the tree which I commanded you not to eat? So Pharaoh commands his men concerning him, and they sent him away, and his wife, and all that he had. And so that's exactly what happens at the end of the garden story, is after this happens, you have God, who's like Pharaoh in this story, who sends Adam and Eve. And if I'm pointing out the word, it's the same Hebrew word.
Okay.
So shalach, it was shalach in Genesis chapter 3. It's going to be shalach right here. So Pharaoh sends them away. So that's one example where it's like, oh, that's interesting. That little story right there. And this is the one that first made me think, does this keep repeating? I saw it in Noah. In fact, I was aware of it in Noah a long time ago. I was like, oh, this is interesting. This is a parallel. But when I saw it here, I thought, is every story going to be like this? And you know what? If you're following the narratives, like I said earlier, sometimes they expand. After Adam and Eve are sent out of the garden, Genesis chapter 4 is going to move into a story of brothers fighting against themselves and fighting against each other. And so what do you get in Genesis chapter 13? You get Abraham and Lot and the herdsmen, and they're struggling once again. So you see the shepherd imagery, you see brothers kind of butting heads. And again, it goes all the way through Genesis chapter 12 in this initial iteration in Abraham. Look at it again in in Genesis chapter 16, where you see it. It says, now Sarai, Abraham's wife, bare him no children, and she had a handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. And Sarah said unto Abraham, behold now, the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid, that it may be well. Go in unto my maid, that I may obtain children by her. And it says, and Abraham hearkened unto the voice of Sarah. So you know Sarah is his wife. God comes down and asks Adam, or he says to him, because you have hearkened unto the voice of your wife. You know? And so right here, you see that right at the beginning of the story, that Abraham is hearkening unto the voice of his wife. And there's actually more cool backstory to this. In fact, like if you're reading it carefully, you see in Genesis chapter 1, the name of God that's used is Elohim. It's just translated God. When you get into Genesis chapter 2, you find that the name of God changes and that it's the Lord God, right? Yod Heh Vav Heh Elohim. That name is only used in Genesis chapter 2. It's not used anywhere else in the book of Genesis, except in chapter 15. And what are you going to find in chapter 15 is Abraham is told about what's going to happen to his descendants as they go into Egypt. But it says before that Abraham gathered all these animals. So think Genesis chapter 2, all of these animals coming to Adam and him giving them names. Well, all these animals are gathered to Abraham. He's going to slaughter them. He's going to make a covenant with God. But it says that that Abraham went into a tardema, a deep sleep. Where else do you find a character who goes into a deep sleep? Again, that's Genesis chapter 2 imagery. So Abraham's put into a deep sleep or goes into a deep sleep just like Adam was put into a deep sleep. Adam emerges from his sleep, and guess what he has? A wife. Abraham emerges from his sleep, and guess what? It's saying, now Sarai, Abraham's wife. And, you know, the Jewish way of interpreting like a text is like there's no superfluous words. If it's going to introduce Abraham's wife, and you already know Abraham's wife is Sarah, that it's meaningful that it's saying his wife right now. It's wanting you to think, oh, Abraham, Sarah's wife, and now all of a sudden Abraham's hearkening unto her voice. Think Adam in the beginning, got his wife, hearkened unto her voice. Good situation, bad situation. It's almost like there's dark clouds, foreboding clouds that are coming on the scene. And so what are we going to have? Sarah's wife, she can't bear. She gets Hagar. She gives them unto Abraham. And what is it going to say? It's going to say, now Sarah, Abraham's wife, she took Hagar, right? And she gave her to her husband to be his wife. Just like the fruit in the beginning, where Eve takes the fruit and gives it to her husband. And so this whole situation with Abraham and Hagar is cast in the light of the fall of man in Genesis chapter 3. So once again, the question is why? Like, how are we supposed to read? Is this a good moment in Abraham's life or a bad moment in Abraham's life? This is Abraham repeating the same mistakes that Adam repeated, the same mistakes that Noah repeated. And I could go through the rest of this and show, look, all of these other words keep occurring too. So after he goes in, it says that Hagar conceives, and when she saw that she had conceived, she was despised. Sarah was going to be despised in her eyes. And Sarah said unto Abraham, "My wrong be upon thee." I think that's interesting theologically, right? That Sarah does this wrong, and then all of a sudden, she says, no, my wrong be upon you. And, when we think about Eve and Adam and stuff, like, the buck really stops with Adam, does it not? He's the one who gets blamed for the fall. It's just interesting to me, little stuff that you see later on, maybe looking at the book of Romans, and you think, well, Paul was heavily influenced by some of these chapters in Genesis writing Romans. And, Sarah says, "My wrong be upon you." And we do attribute the sin initially to Adam in the beginning. She said, "I have given my maid into your bosom, and when I saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between me and you." That expression, "between me and you," is used in the curse where in Genesis chapter 3, 15, 16, where God is talking to the serpent, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, between her seed and your seed." So the whole idea of something in between people and God judging in the situation. So Abraham says unto Sarah, "Behold, thy maid is in thy hand. Do unto her as is pleasing to thee," which means like do whatever is good in your eyes. So Sarah ends up dealing hardly, right? And then Hagar is going to flee the scene. So she flees, and it says the angel of the Lord found her by a fountain of water in the wilderness, by a fountain in the way to Shur. And he said unto Hagar, Sarah's maid, "Where are you coming from, and where are you going?" So there's the question that I was looking for. Where's the question going to be in this story? Well, that's where it pops up. Well, what are you going to have after the question? Verse 10, the angel of the Lord said unto her, "I will multiply your seed." So again, the whole idea of somebody's seed being prominent, just like I will put enmity between your seed and her seed. So the idea of a seed comes up where it should. You keep going. It says, "And the angel of the Lord said unto her, Behold, you are with child, and you shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael." So again, after the fall, right, we have Adam, and Adam called his wife's name Eve. So it's just another parallel that should happen where it does, where somebody is all of a sudden naming something else. That happens in this story. And then you have the whole idea that he will be a wild man, and his hand will be against every man. So again, the idea of a man and his hand playing a role at the end of the Genesis story, yes, that's also true. This is another parallel where it says, "Now lest man stretch forth his hand and take of the tree." So again, man, hand popping up right where it should. The idea of a face, well, it's translated presence right here, but face is important. She called the name.
So presence and face is the same word.
Yes, and so presence in Hebrew is the same. If it's translated presence, it almost always means the face. And so again, at the end of the Genesis
I just
story,
want to make that clear.
yes, yeah. So presence and face mean the same thing. So and you could keep going and looking at the stories. The stories keep.
Well, let's stop there.
Sure, let's stop there.
Let's talk a little bit, get in a little bit on some of that. Okay, so I'm going to just ask you some questions on that to try to get like establish what it is we're saying here. So when you're saying that these stories repeat, is there a boundary that you see as the original story that is repeating over and over? In other words, are you saying that it's the original story is Genesis 1, 2, and 3, or does it go on and include the children of Adam and Eve also in that original section that you see repeating?
It's a hard question to answer because I would say in some way it goes on and includes all the way up to the Tower of Babel. And sometimes I can find an iteration that goes from the Genesis 3 story all the way to a Tower of Babel story. Another part of me says I just want it to stop at 3 because, for instance, the Cain and Abel story is also a reiteration of the garden story. It's the same thing. You can read Genesis chapter 4 and see that there's also a sin taking place and that it's all structured and paralleled. It's all structured the same way and parallels Genesis chapter 3. So in some instances, I can read like, okay, no, it's different now because look, you have the additional theme of brothers fighting against each other where brothers should fight after each other after you have some sort of repeat of Adam's sin in the beginning. Okay, here's brothers fighting again right where it should. Another part of me says, no, look, you can actually just read Genesis 3 as one story, and then Genesis 4 is a reiteration, Genesis 6 is a reiteration, Genesis 9 is a reiteration, Genesis 12 is a reiteration, And
Okay.
so I don't know if that answers your question or doesn't.
Well, I mean, I understand what you're saying. I'm not sure that it's that you've answered it in the sense. I mean, I think you've answered it as well as you can, maybe, but I'm not sure that. So I'm looking at this saying, is this something that I can personally take and incorporate into my belief system? Let's
Okay.
say that's how I look at anything I hear.
Sure.
Right? It's like, can I incorporate this into my belief system? Is this something that I can judge as being true or being something that I could incorporate? And so to do so, one of my questions is, okay, if there are iterations like we're saying, then I would need to know what the actual boundary of that iteration is. And I'm very skeptical of types of views like this, because I've seen some similar, not on Genesis, but similar things where people find these patterns in the scriptures. When the original pattern that you're looking for starts to creep, when you get pattern creep, right? And so it starts to expand. And so it's like, well, this story is iterating 1 through 10 or 1 through 5 or 1 through 6, but now it's only 1 through 3, and 1 through 3 iterates in 5, but now 1 through 5 iterates here, but not there. And so you understand what I'm saying?
Sure, yeah.
So my question is, do you have a methodology, or do you have a way which you could say the original story that is being iterated, this is the boundary of it, or is it kind of flexible?
I mean, I would say if you just wanted to study this out and see for yourself, then just take Genesis 3 as the boundary. Just say, I'm starting in Genesis chapter 3, verse 1. I'm going to the end of the chapter, whatever.
So just
Whatever.
one chapter, single chapter?
Is that your boundary?
No, I mean, that's just I'm saying this is an arbitrary boundary that would be good enough, I think, for you, if you wanted to study it out yourself, to say you would be able to demonstrate that this pattern repeats. Now, again, I don't have this.
So you're saying not 1 and 2, just chapter 3?
No, I think...
No, I
think-
understand you're not saying for yourself. I'm saying right now, to understand what you're suggesting as a suggested study mechanism for me would be just chapter 3.
Just start with 3, because
Okay.
1 and 2 only repeat in the book of Genesis in chapter 8 and 9, because you have a creation of the world narrative, and then you have a destruction of the world, and you have a recreation. So the world does not get recreated again. So don't look for another Genesis 1 and 2 parallel in the rest of the book of Genesis.
And
until you get to another recreation story, in which case all recreation stories use the Genesis chapter 1 parallel. Let me just give you a quick example.
Okay.
When you're looking at the crossing of the Red Sea, and you're having a new nation being born, that chapter, Genesis 14, the end of it, is told and cast in the exact same light as Genesis chapter 1, because what are you going to have?
You
You're
mean
going to have
Exodus 14?
Yes, yes. Exodus 14 is cast in the same light as Genesis chapter 1, because you're going to have day 1, right? God separates light from darkness. Well, what does he do? He ends up camping behind the children of Israel as the Egyptians are coming. It says, and he was light to one, and he was darkness to the other. Day 2, what does God do? He separates the waters from the waters. Well, what's he going to do next in Exodus 14? Is he going to divide the Red Sea? You're going to separation of waters. Then you have day 3 in Genesis 1. The dry land appears. Guess what? It talks about dry land appearing. Again, these are all the same words. So like, for instance, I would say, yep, right there, because we're looking at a new creation narrative, you're going to see these themes, right? The Genesis 1 and 2 parallel popping up again where you would expect to see it. But as far as the rest of the stories in Genesis, so after the Noah story, don't look for Genesis 1 and 2 themes to emerge. I would say don't look for Genesis 1 themes to emerge.
Okay.
2 and 3 are the same. I would say study 2 and 3 together.
Okay.
Because that's a large enough window for you to see it repeated. Because once again, like where people fall asleep and then all of a sudden they have a wife, like Jacob, he goes and he's sleeping on his stone, and he has a crazy dream, and all of that's also the Genesis 3 story. But then guess what he's going to get after that? He gets his wife. You have a bride story. So somebody goes to sleep, there's a bride. Somebody goes to sleep, there's a bride. So I'd say you could expand it out to Genesis 2 and 3. But if you want to just make it easy, just study Genesis chapter 3. That's more than enough. There are 25, 30 different words that you're going to say. These definitely repeat in every story. And not only do they repeat like it's just a word, they carry the same meaning, like nuance. What it meant in this story, it means the same thing in this story. For instance, Eve reaching for that tree that was off limits that she shouldn't have had, taking it and giving it to her husband. That's the same thing as Sarah taking Hagar, right? In the beginning, they weren't believing God, were they? They weren't trusting him for what God said, what he commanded, how they should live, and a lot of problems resulted of it. Same thing in the Abraham narrative. Abraham was told by God in Genesis chapter 15 that he's going to have, a lot of children. It's going to be like the stars of the heavens, sand of the sea, and all of a sudden, does he go out on faith and believe and do what he was doing in chapter 15? No, he kind of falls at this moment, and a lot of negativity results from it. You get Ishmael born, who ends up paralleling the Cain character, who's trying to go after Isaac. So
Okay.
So I don't know if that's
No, I
helpful.
understand
Okay.
what you're saying.
Yeah.
So then, I guess my question now would be, what is let's say that, for sake of argument, we stipulate that all these iterations are true and that they're there, and we'll go back and visit that.
Sure.
But let's stipulate that for the moment and say that's the case. What is the takeaway from that? What is gained by understanding that, other than the understanding itself?
So again, this is, I can show the pattern, and I think I can conclusively prove.
Well, we've stipulated that it's there.
Okay. The next is what does it mean? So this is, again, I'm not as hard and fast on this is exactly what it means, but I'll tell you what I've thought about and what I've pondered and just meditated on. The idea that the sins of our fathers have a very real impact in our lives, and that we are given opportunities to correct them for generations that follow. And as you read the book of Genesis, you will see that there are times where the story repeats and where somebody doesn't fail and they do something right. And as a result of them doing something right, blessing follows. And it's just like, if you do what God said, blessings follow. If you don't do what God said, curses follow. And so to me, I began to think about my own life and my own family history and take the story seriously. Like, if I can map this out so faithfully in the book of Genesis, could I map it out in my own life and say, you know what, I struggle with some of the same things my grandfather struggled with, that I know for sure, and I can already see tendencies in my children. And if I don't take the step now to make serious, like the Hebrew word that I was using in the study is called tikkun, but it means like a correction, like a repair. If you don't take the step now to actually repair it, then you throw it to the next generation and you say, you deal with it. And how this becomes meaningful, Christologically to us, we can go through more of these studies, but just to get to the final climactic moment in the book of Genesis, I have to at least mention it, because otherwise it doesn't make sense, is Joseph. Joseph is the character who ends up rectifying Adam's sin in the book of Genesis. And again, there's lots of different ways you can look at things, and I'm not always trying to jump and throw everything on Christ right away, typologically. I'm saying, just as literature, you reading the book of Genesis, it has a clear beginning that sets up the storyline. It has a clear ending that mirrors that storyline with a successful story. And that story is Joseph. And where do we see it? We see Joseph in Potiphar's house, and he's given control over everything. He says it, master's committed everything into my hands, just like Adam in the beginning had access to everything except one thing, right? Except that one tree of the knowledge of good and evil that he couldn't have. And what is that tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the Joseph story? It's Potiphar's wife. And it's like she's coming at him like, come on, just do it. And then, like I said, if you look at the iterations, you'll see that eating and sexual union are synonymous in the stories. If one is eating and drinking in one story, in the next story, what fills that place is going to be something sexually that happens. For instance, with Abraham, we just looked at with Hagar. It was a sexual relationship instead of eating, a fruit or whatever. But so what's going to happen? It's going to say that Joseph hearkened not unto her voice, which is exactly what Adam did in the beginning. He hearkened unto the voice of the wife in the story, and it led to the downfall. But here Joseph doesn't. And what happens is Joseph, he gets his cloak grabbed, and all of a sudden it's stripped off of him. And what is he? Just like Adam in the beginning, he's naked. But the literary arc is the opposite. Whereas Adam's nakedness in the beginning is a falling away from the nakedness of chapter 2, where they were naked and they were not ashamed, Joseph's nakedness is a returning back to the garden. He's actually undoing what Adam has done in the storyline and going to gain once again what Adam lost. So he becomes naked, and then we find all of these other parallels. There's a loud voice, right? And Joseph's afraid, and he runs and he leaves. But what happens to Joseph after this is he just gets exalted, right? I mean, he goes through a period where it's, he goes into jail again after this. But as far as like the book of Genesis goes, he becomes a person who the text says is filled with the Spirit of God, the Ruach Elohim, that he's filled with God's Spirit, just like Adam had God's breath breathed into him in the beginning. Same word. Once again, Pharaoh saying, where can we find a man like this who has the Spirit of God? We find at the very end of the book of Genesis that when Joseph is dealing with his brothers, they come to him and after their father dies, and they say, before Dad died, he said, don't treat us badly for all of the stuff that we've done to you. Just forgive us and go ahead. And Joseph says, am I in the place of God? He asks this question, am I in the place of God to do this? He said, what you meant for, and here's your key words, what you meant for evil, God intended for good. And so it began with good and evil in the beginning, and it ends with a character who has the knowledge of good and evil. And how and why does he have the knowledge of good and evil? Not because he did what Adam did, because he did the opposite of what Adam did. So
Okay.
All right. So as far as literature goes, I'll let you.
We have a question real quick.
Go.
It's from Michael Pemberton. If an author wanted to simplify a complex set of stories, they would establish a set of motives and types to carry meaning and keep the work small. Why would I assume this is mystical?
Mystical? Did I mention the word mystical? Mike, maybe I don't know.
No.
I definitely. I mean, if
No, you didn't say the word
Mike's looking into my heart. I mean, he knows that's what I think, but I didn't say that.
No, you did not say mystical.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say right now that I'm arguing for something mystical. What I'm arguing is for something meaningful, that your actions have a direct bearing on your children and your genealogy, and that we live in a world where
Right. No, I understand. Yeah. I understand the application you're saying here, and I think what Mike Pemberton is trying to ask. Let me see, and I could be wrong. I don't know, but I'm going to try to explain his question, which I think is a fair question,
okay,
in wording that might be a little more accurate. I think what he's asking is, or what he's saying, and this is a question I have also. Is this what we're looking at? A literary device that is written into the story, or is this the actual stories happen this way? You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do.
So how would you put that? Is this let's say Moses wrote the whole book. I'm not sure.
I get what you're asking.
Right.
I don't think that it's an either or. Number one, I don't think that question necessarily has to be, was it just written this way, or did it really happen this way? I think it can be. It could be both.
But
I would argue more that it's written this way. I would argue that the author understands the history of what has happened and has chosen to verbally structure it.
The reason why I would say that, even though I understand, it doesn't have to be an either or in probability law, but it almost has to be an either or when you look at it in any practical way, because the stories are highly edited, meaning not every moment of Joseph's life is put in there.
Sure.
And there's an argument to be made that may not everything be in perfect chronological order, because it's told from a perspective,
okay,
right? And so whenever you tell a story from a perspective, you're not going to get an objective chronological order, because you don't perceive you don't perceive something to have happened in the chronological order that a bird would have flying over the whole scene. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So as a historian, you're going to edit the story according to your perspective and according to your purpose, right? So it means you're going to omit things you don't find to be meaningful to the point of the story that as you see it. Does that
Yeah,
make
fair.
sense?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
so, but then the question is, are they narrating a story as it is, or are they taking histories, and writing a story narratively to mirror the story in Genesis 3? In other words, did they inadvertently? This is where I'm kind of stumbling because I'm trying to
No,
figure
I
out
get,
his
I
question.
get, I get what you're asking.
So I think the question, kind of how you would ask Mike's question, is: did this happen mystically? In other words, did this happen like the author, the writer of Genesis, didn't realize it necessarily?
No.
They weren't planning it. They just happened to live their life that way, and it mirrors that. Or did the writer of Genesis want to tell a single story, and he used the narrative form of a history to do so?
Again, I wouldn't say that they're mutually exclusive, but I would lean towards the latter.
Okay.
I would say that it's written in such a way as the author is telling you true events, but the way that he's writing is giving you an interpretive lens at how to view these events. Otherwise, you don't know how to view the events. I mean, you can speculate on the meaning of these events, but when you see the events patterned after the fall, and then sometimes patterned after a correction of the fall, well, then you have a meaning. You can say,
Right.
oh, this character's correcting
that's
this, and
fair
I
enough.
see the results.
Okay, that's fair enough. I was just trying to get
Sure.
his question.
Do you mind
in
reading
there.
his question one more time? Just as I'm just lost on the
If
mystical
an
part.
author wanted to simplify a complex set of stories, they would establish a set of motives and types to carry meaning and keep the work small.
I mean, I guess so, but I would say, Moses is telling quite a bit of history right here from the creation to
Mm-hmm.
the Joseph narrative. I mean, you're looking at a 2,000-year period of time, and it's only 50 chapters. I mean,
Yeah.
you can
Well,
read
no,
it.
that's
You can
what I
read
said.
it in
They're
a day.
highly
So I
edited.
would say if maybe I'm understanding Mike's the question now, maybe not even as a question, but him saying like, yeah, this is what the author is doing. The author is taking a 2,000-year period of time, and he has created a set of verbal clues, a literary structure that helps you look at all of this chunk of history and say, yeah, this is what we're supposed to mean,
Okay.
or this is what the meaning of it is.
I have a question,
Go ahead.
actually. So, we obviously see types, and it's repeating itself, right? What's wrong with saying that obviously that's human nature throughout history? Not necessarily it's repeating itself in a ways that, it's going back to that. But obviously, from then and now, I butt heads with my brother.
Sure.
I take things from people.
Yeah.
People get drunk, they wake up naked. It's just what, I don't,
Yeah.
I've seen
It's
people
happened
do,
to all of
I've
us,
seen people do
yeah.
crazy stuff on it, right? And
Yeah.
so it seems, people, get wives from one day to the,
Sure.
right. So is that too hard to say that that's just what happens in life?
Yeah,
Those things will happen. Things get repeated over and over and over again. But it doesn't mean that somebody's life that's going to happen 10,000 years from now is going to relate to me necessarily.
Okay.
It's just life itself repeating itself over and over and over again, just because of the way we are.
I think that I wanted to get into this later, but we'll look at it real
Sure.
quickly. Let me try to like focus that in a little bit to where I wanted to ask you on that,
Okay.
and then you can respond to that. So, my question, going with Nolan, or kind of in line with Nolan, is how to distinguish between this being a literary pattern and this being simply a dearth of available elements. So it's like, one of the things when I listen to your thing that I struggle with and I wrestle with is that you're like, well, we see eating and we see sex and we see sleeping, and it's like, yeah, that's like 90% of all life.
Sure.
So I would expect to see a lot of that.
Yeah.
Right. And so to me, it would be a little more clear if there were these elements that were like, well, this isn't something that usually happens, and yet here it is happening an awful lot. And yet when we say, well, here somebody sleeps and has a dream, it's like, that's a little harder for me to attribute pattern to.
Sure, I get what you're saying. So this is kind of what I was saying, that I didn't think the two different views of whether this really happened this way or if it was just literarily written this way are mutually exclusive. Again, I agree. I think what the story said in the beginning, it happened. And so as a result of it, you're going to see this initial fall of mankind played out in each of these stories. Now, again, we're looking at literature. It is literature.
Correct.
So, I mean, I'm asking literary questions.
No, I
about
understand.
And the thing that I would say gives more weight to it is that not only do these words occur, like, yeah, of course people eat. Yeah, of course people sleep. Of course there's illicit sexual relationships that take place. Of course there's murder. Of course, of course, all stories are going to have these components, but that they are told in the same order, right? That these verbs occur, I mean, I'm talking about fairly regularly, exactly in the same order. Okay, here's this character doing this, and then repeat. Turn the page.
Okay.
Here's this character doing this. Yep, turn the page. So to me, that gives more weight to that you're looking at the author using some sort of literary structure to try to tell you that this is. And again, I mean, it's like, how do you know you're looking at a great piece of literature? You find these inclusios, like the beginning of this book looks like the end of this book. The story starts with good and evil, and it ends with good and evil. Maybe the point of the book is good and
Right.
evil, And so, well, then what do I have to go off of? You say like, oh, well, you're just using all of the elements of the story. I don't have any other
No, I
elements
understand.
to use, right?
So let's go back to where we were though before we got on that, because I this is where I think is where I would like to try to press you on a little bit and try to understand a little better what you're saying. Or what you're trying to say, and you may still be thinking through this. And,
Sure.
And you said, how like when you're given the study, a lot of it you were like wrestling with it at the time. And I personally think that anytime anyone speaks extemporaneously, they're thinking out loud.
Sure.
And it should be judged like that. By judge, I mean we should have a level of understanding and tolerance.
Yeah.
Right? Because this is why we don't want politicians doing that, speaking off the cuff. We don't want them thinking out loud. We want them to think. Write the speech.
Did anybody tell this to Trump or no?
They should tell it to a lot of people. We don't want them to think, and then we want them to think and then come to a conclusion, write the speech, and then speak, not think out loud. But when you speak extemporaneously without actual speech written out, you're thinking. And I think that we need to be very tolerant. And so if you're like, I said that, but that's not where I'm at now, that's fair. I'm not here to like, hold people like that. It's like we're thinking now, you were thinking then, and so. Don't think I'm like trying to pin you.
I'm all right.
All right.
You can pin me. It's fine.
No, I don't want to pin you. I want you to think, and I want you to have the freedom to feel free to do so, and I will as well. Okay.
Deal.
All right. So when I look at this, I'm trying to go back to the point of what is the point of this? Okay. What is the point? If I lay all these stories up and I stipulate that this is true, and so we're not saying is it true, we're saying it is true, stipulated to be true. What is the point? Now, what you gave me was that you get the chance to do tikkun, right? To do a reparation or an emendation to the story. Well, I'm not convinced that this palimpsest, as I'm calling it, provides that any better than is already provided. In other words, I don't see that. To me, if that's the point, then it seems like a lot of work to prove or to give somebody what's not hard to do. I mean, that's already there. And then I'm not sure it bears out. It's like, well, they can make the story right. And then it'll be right for their generations. But it isn't. I mean, Joseph makes the story right, but it's not right for his generations. See what I'm saying?
What do you mean? Give me an example.
Well,
of
yeah,
it's
like
not
he fixes Adam's problem, right?
Yeah.
He does the tikkun is the word, right? He does the tikkun. Okay, so then it's over. The story's done. I mean, no one after that has a problem.
No.
Well, then I don't see. Then I'm not saying he didn't do that. What I'm saying is, I don't see how that's answering what the purpose of all this is.
So again, just because you fix something on a personal level, right? The story then expands out onto a national level, and where you see that for instance, there's a fighting between Joseph and Judah, like in this story. They kind of become the main characters at the end of the book, Well, you know what? You find these two main characters become the northern kingdom and southern kingdom of Israel. And there's also a replay of this on a national level. But as far as like just meaning, like if I were just to be able to say, okay, here's my ace card. My ace card would be Christ. Like when you look at Christ, how can you not read the story, even Paul in Romans 5, how can you not read the story as that he's the antitype character for what Adam did in the beginning, and that's why all of these elements show up once again in Christ's story. That's why he's in a garden. That's why there is a cup of blood. That's why there is a brother. But I mean, that's why there is a tree. That's why he is naked. That's why because he's making a repair for what Adam did in the story. I mean, that, like, to me, that's if that doesn't work, then I don't think the book has much more meaning, because God created a good world, man screwed it up, and he has to. We're going to get back to that garden.
No, but now you've
right?
gone to a very decisive and very overt either or scenario where it's like, if this iteration isn't taking place, then the book wouldn't have much meaning. But there's other ways.
That's not exactly. Maybe that's how I said it, but that's not exactly what I mean. What I'm trying to say is that iteration becomes very important in the Gospels, and that
that may be true, and I don't want to really. That would be a whole nother subject, right? And I want to try to stay on your study and for the moment, anyways. And so, but I would put my view into it, and that is that Christ could be an iteration of Genesis, or an antitype, not an iteration, an antitype of Adam and of the Genesis story, without necessitating for all of Genesis to be that iteration. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do.
You could have an antitype and not an iterative structure. So it doesn't. So Christ is, in my view, you saying, well, Christ is this, therefore I think this means Genesis.
Doesn't necessarily.
It doesn't necessarily follow exactly.
Yeah, I'm with you. That's not necessarily true.
And I'm not trying to disprove your hypothesis right now. I'm really not. I'm just trying to press it and test it. But to me, the real issue on this is I can't, and I really worked hard at this, and I mean I worked a long time on this with your study, and I can't for the life of me find where you point out the actual objective of this, not of your teaching of it. Because I'm fine with teaching things that are just information. It's like, what does it matter? Well, it's true. Well, that matters because it's true. Okay, fine. But you seem to you in your study you allude often to there being. It's not the word you use, but I'm just going to use it. A revelation that's going to come from this. You're going to see this, and when you do, you're going to see something you hadn't seen before. And as much as I listened to it, and I didn't hear all the studies, so if I missed it, you tell me. But all the ones I heard, I never heard anything where I'm like, okay, even if I don't accept it as revelatory, I never heard you express anything where it's like, okay, I see what he thinks he sees by seeing this. So what would that be?
If I were to put it into words, I would say it goes back to the idea of good and evil, and it goes back to the knowledge of good and evil, and the idea of God being able to use evil for good. Okay, that to me was the revelation that Joseph gives to you at the end of the book, that you as men intended evil, but God at the same time was using it for good, and that once I saw that, right, that to me was what was revelatory to me, because I realized that's what was going on at the cross, that you were there once again with the tree of life, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was all there, and you're looking at the greatest possible evil and the greatest possible good overlaid at the exact same time. And I thought, this is incredible, because and again, I tried to use different metaphors and stuff throughout the study and this is what I didn't want to say in the study, because I think it very quickly gets misunderstood what I'm trying to say, and you could take it and make me say something that I think is not what I'm getting across. Okay. But that's why I was hinting at it. That's why I was trying to allude to, and I wanted people to see it, because I wanted people to say that this is what the book is saying, not me saying this is what the book is saying. I wanted you to see all of these different stories at the same time and see how God was working every single nuance in detail to produce Joseph, who in the end of the book saves the world. You know, and how, like, who is it? So I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. Yeah. I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay. I have a couple issues with it, so let's look at those. So one of them is that I think you make a common mistake when it comes to this type of teaching that makes me very skeptical when I hear any type of teaching. And by this type of teaching, I mean typology teaching, okay? When you say this is a type of this. I grew up in a family that preached like that always. My granddad, that was the majority of his sermons was type teaching, and so I'm naturally skeptical against it. And one of the reasons why, I shouldn't say naturally because I'm not. I'm trained to be by my I've trained myself to be skeptical, to be more accurate. Anyways, one of the reasons why I'm skeptical of typology is because I find that they cheat too often. Okay? And I don't mean this in insulting anybody's way, okay? But I find, and I say cheat, and I don't mean they're insincere, okay? But I find that they cheat too often. And for instance, I think it was cheating what you just did, where you say, where you cite an obvious type that I think most believers would accept, which is Joseph and Jesus and Adam. And you got these three. And you're like, see how there's there's parallels here, and everyone accepts them. And it's like, yes, Joseph. I think. For give you an example of where I stand on that. I think that when it says that he's going to be called a Nazarene, speaking of Jesus, it's referring to the curses and the blessing of Joseph, where it says that Joseph will be a Nazarene, a Nazir.
The blessing will be upon the head.
Well, he'll be a Nazir of his brother. He'll be cast away, and I think Joseph is a type of Christ, right? So I think that most Christians accept those three. So you make the case of the three we accept, and then you smuggle in the rest. You smuggle in all these other ones in and say, well, then this validates all of these parallels that I've drawn elsewhere. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And I find that problematic.
Sure.
Because that, to me, you're only proving you're using something we all accept to be true to then sneak in what is, it's essentially, in logic, it's called begging the question, right? You're sneaking it in with a pile of things we agree with. You're packaging it all up together. And I would need you to make the case for everyone. And this leads me to one more thing, then I'll let you respond.
Yeah.
Another issue that I find when I'm listening to all this is that because it's dense, your teachings, right? Well, by dense, what I mean is
There's a lot of material.
A lot of material, exactly. And I don't mean that it's not a negative. It's just a fact. Right, and I think you would accept that. I mean, you really pack in tons of details, right? And because it's that way, then I feel that for me to even how would I put this? To even prove it would require me to almost nitpick it apart because there's so much. I can't say, well, because I could point to any one of them. I could give you, say, 15 right off the bat, boom, where it's like, I don't know, this doesn't make sense. But there's let's say 400 details in every class, in every study you do. And so then it's like the problem, and it's not just, this isn't personal. I find this typical of this type of teaching. So then it's like you almost have to tear it to shreds, right, in order to say that maybe this isn't accurate. Because I don't feel you did a good enough job to say, I am proposing something that is very difficult. And instead of overwhelming you with details, just a flood of details that you would then have to take 40 hours to tear apart, I'm going to make a case and explain why this matters, and I'm going to make a few strong points of it that you can test. Because if I can't make the strong points stick, then I can't just overwhelm you with details and make it stick. Am I making sense? Am I explaining myself?
No, totally. So
how would you respond?
There's a lot there to try to respond to. So
sure.
I'll try to work my way backwards, and maybe you can help me remember some of
the
No,
that's
stuff.
fine, yeah.
So the final teachings that I did over Noah, that was what I did. So I mentioned earlier, this was all extemporaneously. It was scientific to me in that I had a hypothesis that I was working through while at the same time trying to give people meaty, meaningful, interesting teachings every week. So, a lot of it in this study, I would say, is not entirely thought out. And I didn't have an overall picture. I was really working through the text and week by week coming up, like being baffled by, whoa, there it is again. Oh, there's another pattern. Oh, there it is. So that I say would be a fair assessment of my of my teachings, in that like I throw tons of information out there, and it's not.
Do you understand why someone
totally.
like me would find that very problematic?
Totally. But it's, again, I would like to be able to make a commentary on Genesis, having been away from this for over a year now. This teaching, I've been able to think about it a lot more. I've been able to formulate thoughts, and again, it's not like I have it all worked out, but I think I could put it into a package that was easier for you to see and say. So the final teachings that I did over Noah, Noah 1 and Noah 2, that was what I tried to do. And that was why I tried to give you those teachings. Because and again, it's not perfect, but I would say I in those teachings, those two of them, and they're just one teaching, but split into two parts, I have all of these basic, where I'm trying to show you, here's the words, I highlighted them for you, I've made my case, this is my basic argument. Go ahead, look at this. If you want to rip this apart, this is I think a stronger case that I have. I think I could make a better case for the rest of the book of Genesis now. So I would say, look, it was a work in progress. So
No, I get
it was
that.
an interesting work in progress. I still think people would benefit from
I get that, and that's perfectly fair. That's fair,
Yeah.
completely fair, and that's why I'm not here picking
Sure.
apart, because I understand that.
Okay.
But what I am saying,
I want to
though-
go back to the typology.
Okay, go
though.
ahead.
Okay,
Go
so
ahead.
to answer that, I would say also in this study, I tried to, and maybe I didn't do a good job, right? I tried to not make it all typology. I tried to, in the vast majority of the study, stick to Genesis and not jump to the New Testament.
No.
and
When I
not-
say typology, let me be clear. I'm not
Yeah.
talking that you're saying this is a type of Christ.
Yeah.
I think the whole study is typology, and that you're saying we have a archetype or an original story that is iterating. We see it recast again and again. That's
Sure.
typology.
Yeah.
To the story.
Okay. See, I would say that was.
I'm not using-
I would say that was thematic. Like
That's fine. Whatever.
yeah,
I'm not.
But
you
yeah,
understand?
So I
to
get what
me,
you're saying.
the nature of the teaching is the same. My point isn't.
I would say it's a little different, and here's why. Because I'm only looking in one book, so I'm trying to say.
No, but you're doing
that there is a theme.
I understand.
That is
I understand what you're
and then
saying.
the theme is in the next chapter, and I'm not saying it's a type of it. Types are different.
But I'm not. My point isn't whether it's a type or not. My point is it's the type of teaching. It's the style of teaching.
Yeah.
That I immediately am. Oh, I'm just explaining. I am immediately skeptical when I hear any type of typology, whether it be Old Testament to New Testament, which is the most common, right?
Yeah.
But any type of pattern type seeking, when you're seeking for patterns, whether it be in the same book, within the same author's corpus of writing, or across all writers and everything, it doesn't matter to me. Whenever people start trying to point out patterns, I get the hairs on my neck stand up, and I'm like, I get very, very skeptical myself.
Yeah.
Okay, and I find that they commit many of the same errors.
And,
Right.
and that's fair. I would say I'm on the opposite end of biblical study in that when I study the Bible, because I feel like I'm aware that this is how the writers of Scripture write, and it's how the writers of Scripture comment on their own writings. It's how they basically supply a commentary for you as you read the text, that I'm always looking for patterns, because I feel like what they don't say right here, they explain here.
Let me ask you something.
Yeah.
Real quick,
Yeah, go
if
ahead.
you don't mind. It's my question. When you say that, don't you think you've, lack for a better phrase, dulled your senses, in the sense that you are not thinking, or you don't see it clearly as much as you would have if you're not necessarily looking for them?
You think maybe
Are
I,
you
I
biased?
try
You're asking, are you
biased,
biased?
yeah.
I try to find it, whether it's there
That
or
was
not.
basically
Yeah.
be my question. How do you know? My question was it was kind of along those same lines. My question is, and you can maybe answer both together, but my question is, how do you know? No, that wasn't my question. Hold on. My question is this. Is it possible to see a pattern that isn't there?
Yeah, of course. I think it's possible to see a pattern that isn't there. Is it possible to see a pattern that is there? I would ask.
Is it possible to see something that is there? Well,
Yeah,
yes,
I
that,
mean,
I think is an obvious answer.
well, I think your question also is sort of obvious. Is it possible?
Oh
to see a
no,
pattern?
that isn't obvious. In fact,
No.
to see something that is not there.
Yeah, I mean, I think people.
How can you see something that isn't there?
People can presuppose that there is a pattern when there's not a pattern. You know, they may, for instance.
But what if it's without prejudice?
What?
Well, you're saying they presuppose, so they're saying there's a pattern, I'm going to go find it. But
okay.
what if you're going and you don't have a prejudice? You're not going with a presupposition and you see a pattern. Are patterns that are seen like that, is it possible that they don't exist?
Yes, it's possible.
Okay.
So for instance, like I'm just trying to think of an example. So for instance, some people say, "Man, I get stopped at every red light." You know, they're driving. And what they've done is they've just kind of assumed, or I shouldn't say assumed, that
They focused on
they
focused on
and
the
made
ones that
mental
annoyed them.
notes of it, and then they create a pattern that isn't there. I would say yes.
Okay, that's
in that
fair.
way,
That's a good.
in
That's
that
a good
way,
illustration.
people see patterns that maybe
Okay,
aren't real
so
patterns.
then the question is this, and this isn't a gotcha question.
Sure.
Okay, I don't ask gotcha questions. This is an honest question. So, if it's possible to see patterns that aren't there, then the question is, what is the methodology that keeps us? And I don't want you to take this as being this study particularly.
Sure.
This is more of an abstract question. What methodology can be employed that you can say this is a methodology that would keep somebody from seeing patterns that aren't there?
In the text.
Well, this is
that's
abstract, but whatever.
It's a big question.
Well, see, this is my problem,
Yeah,
and I'll let you
well-
think about it for a second, but let me explain why I asked this. Because this goes back to what I'm saying and my problem with what I'm calling typology, the pattern-seeking type study and teaching, in that I don't find that those who engage in it have ever considered what boundaries there are to not do that, to not find patterns that don't exist. I've asked people about this, and I've discussed this with other people, and I don't find that anyone has ever established himself and said, okay, it's possible to see something that's not there. I'm liable to see something that's not there. I have to implement these boundaries or safeguards so that I'm not seeing things that aren't there.
Sure. I would say I at least personally tried to do this in that when I did the studies, I was trying to ask other people in the studies. If you listen to them, you'll hear. I mean, I'm not convinced till near the end of the book that this is indeed the case, that this pattern occurs over and over again. And I'm trying to bounce it off of other minds.
So let me give you an objective criticism then on
Sure.
that point. As a friend and an objective critic, I would tell you that your gift of teaching makes that practically impossible to get objective feedback from the audience that I heard in the tapes. I appreciate that you're sincere in looking for it.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to get it there.
Well, that's why I'm meeting with you.
That's what I was just
Yeah.
about to say.
Yeah.
No, that's what I was just about to say.
It's true.
I was just about to say that one of the things I didn't mention in my prose
Yeah.
is the fact that you would come and send me all the material and the tapes and say, this is what I want to talk to you about, because I know you knew
Yeah.
what my response was going to be.
Absolutely.
So kudos, and I'm giving you that objective criticism of your original audience, and I'm absolutely acknowledging that you coming here is your desire to put it to the test.
Yeah.
And I applaud you for that.
Thank you.
I really do. I acknowledge it. I have it in my notes. I'm like, this is amazing. That's great. I'm happy with that.
thank
So that's fair.
Most people
that's a
don't.
fair.
So it is impressive, actually.
Oh,
You know,
very.
most people don't ever ask him what they actually, because he knows he's going to be honest.
Yeah.
And people don't really want honesty.
Yeah. Well, I do. I mean, this
No, obviously.
Obviously, if you're here.
Because you and I have had our
butted heads.
discussions.
Yeah,
We've
but in
butted
a
heads.
nice way.
Of course,
Yeah.
as friends. But our ideas, we've put them
Sure.
to test, right? So you knew coming in here that it wasn't going to be a fawning audience to say, this is
Absolutely.
amazing.
Yeah.
That I was going to put it to the test, right?
Of course.
So that is a good answer, right? You're saying I'm looking for people to test it with. So that's a fair answer. And we only have, I mean, I could say, well, why didn't you go? But that's not what I'm doing.
Sure.
You're doing that methodology there. But I do think, and this is not a question I have an answer to, so that's why I say it's not a gotcha question.
Okay.
Because I don't have an answer for this. It's one reason why I do not do pattern teaching or even hardly pattern study.
Yeah.
Even in the epistles of Paul, which I read incessantly almost, I abstain from pattern seeking because I don't have an answer to the question, which is, what methodology keeps me from seeing what isn't there? I've seen too many elephants in the clouds.
I get what you're saying.
You see what I'm
I get
saying?
what you're saying.
Yeah.
I do. I think it's an important question. Like, I should ask it. I should think about it. I should try to say, here's a lot of, some of my safeguards or rails that I'm putting in place so I don't fall off the road here. But I guess just the other side of it is like, look, I was a Jewish studies major, so I've read a lot of the rabbis. This is how the rabbis read the Bible. This is how they've read it for a long time. This is how they teach the Bible. This is what they're looking for when they study the Bible. This is how they derive meaning from Scripture. So, I mean, I would say it's not a perfect answer, but like I'm leaning on like quite a bit of history in terms of studying the text.
Okay, so that brings up another issue I wanted to deal with you on this. And so when you say, the rabbis, this is how they've done this. The problem I have with that is I don't find the New Testament authors engaging in this type of study.
See, I would argue differently.
Okay, that's what I want to hear.
So I would say, like, for instance, I could show you lots of different text, and you may disagree, probably you would, but I could show you lots of different texts where I think the New Testament writers are playing off of Old Testament text.
Just give me one example of what you think is a good example. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I want to be clear on this. It's not like, no, it doesn't. Tell me one. I'm saying I agree that there's some of this, but you give us a good example of what you think that is so that we can have a specific one to talk about.
So, for instance, I mean, like the main one that I had mentioned earlier, that Christ is in a garden in the end, that you have the elements of blood, that you have the elements of wine, that you have somebody being killed, that you have a tree, that you have somebody naked, that you have, I mean, all of these different things where I would say these elements are meaningful because the writers are leaning upon Genesis chapter 3 in telling
okay,
this
but this
story.
gets
I know
us
that's
back to,
not a great one.
It's
But
not, but it's fine. It's fine because I'm not going to be picky on this.
Sure.
What I am going to do is I'm going to say, let's look at this for a moment. You can think about it maybe better
I mean,
one.
I could think of lots of them.
But let's look at this for a moment because it gets us to a different subject.
Sure.
So we're going to kind of change subjects based on that.
Fair.
So this goes back to the whole thing of, is it written this way or did it happen this way, right? And when you say that they include these elements, well, I'm not convinced that that is a literary mechanism by the gospel writers to say, hey, let's include these elements. Because those, I mean, if they were insignificant elements at the time, then to editorially include them would be meaningful. It's like you could have chosen anything that happened that night, but you only chose these, and these happen to reflect Genesis 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, that's interesting, right? But if it's the most important things that happened that night, and that's why they're included, then it's not a literary device. In other words, I see, let me explain
I get what you're saying.
Let me explain a little more. I know you get it, but let me explain a little more where I'm trying to say. So one of the things you mention often in your studies are chiasms, which are absolute literary devices, right? That's why they have a name. They're actually a formal literary device. For anyone that's watching doesn't know, a chiasm comes from the Greek letter chi, which looks like an X, right? And the idea is you have a greater than, lesser than symbol literarily, right? If you visualize the text, it comes down to a point in the middle. And so you'll have, like, for instance, birth, just to give a real simple example, you have birth, life, death, death, life, birth.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And you'll have a literary structure that is grammatically unified, that can commonly, you don't need any type of decoder ring to see it. It's using common grammar that everyone can understand, and it purposefully contrasts these two halves of the story so that they all bring you down to a focal point to say, this is what mattered of the story.
Yeah.
And to do that, they will often put the story out of order, like the Gospels do at times. I'm not saying they're chiasms. I'm just saying
sure.
there is literature like the Gospels that is purposefully told out of order in order to emphasize something they find more important than chronological history. You with me on that?
Yes, definitely.
And so that would be a literary device that is often put in to text. It's across languages. It's a very common literary device, as you know. Okay, so that's a literary device where we see it's intentionally put in by an author as a literary device. But when you have stories told, which I can't find any recognizable literary device in them that happen to have the same elements,
Well, okay, so let me
Now,
just,
those elements may be
may I
meaningful.
jump in right here?
Let me just
Okay.
finish. So those elements may be meaningful. I'm not saying the elements therefore have no meaning.
Yeah.
I'm just saying they don't have a literary device meaning.
But see, I would say they do. The literary device meaning is called parallelism. Parallelism is where you have two stories that run in parallel.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is a literary device. I mean, that's well known, that's established.
Yes.
It's used easily just as much as chiasms are used in scripture. And parallelism is the literary device that I was using. So the stories I'm arguing are told in parallel, which enable you to look at this story and then kind of move back and forth. And what I was trying to say in the studies was the text will work the same way that your eyes work, you know? One eye sees one thing, one eye sees another thing, and they're not looking at exactly the same thing, but they're looking at enough that your brain can create the ability to see a little bit of depth into the story and maybe say, oh, I see a little bit deeper into what's being communicated because it was told in this way. Does that make sense or no?
I understand what you're saying.
So, I mean, so I would
But
just argue
yes.
that is.
Yeah, you're saying that the parallel, but here's what I'm saying though, and I understand. I'm not saying that you're arguing that everything's a chiasm.
Yeah.
So if we take parallelism as a literary device, it has to be obvious to me. To me, it has to be an obvious by design. Otherwise, it's not a literary device. It can't be by coincidence or by happenstance or by sovereign design even. Just because God might have sovereignly designed history to parallel each other doesn't make it a literary device.
I mean, okay.
You
but
see what I'm saying?
I get what you're saying, but I feel like
No, I understand.
I
It's
feel-
a little nitpicky.
yeah,
yes.
it's a little nitpicky because it backs me into the corner. Like because look, I've tried to show in the studies, and I'd be with you if I had one of them. Okay, fine. But if I can show you that out of the 25 stories that are told in Genesis, 23 of them follow a literary parallel that each have at least 10 correspondences in each story.
Okay,
so I would say it's the weight of it. I agree
No,
with you
I
on
understand,
any,
but this
on
goes
any
back to the-
smaller on any smaller set. Like, okay, yeah, well, this one says eyes and this one says eyes. That's not a good enough. But if this one says eyes, eyes, nose, nose, mouth, mouth, hand, hand, foot, foot.
Right.
You say, all right, probably it's intentional. You know, and if it happened one time, maybe. If it happens a dozen times,
Well,
like
no,
I
but
don't know how I can establish any more. Like,
But here's the
for
problem.
instance, how maybe I could turn it around and try to say that if this was indeed the case, how would you prove that it was the case?
Okay, so let me
against your
explain to
own
you why
questions?
I'm
Yeah.
still very skeptical that you've proven the case.
Sure.
And that's because I find too many elements that don't correspond to any parallelism, because the original story grows and shrinks as needed. See, I would say you establish the boundary, which is where I started with you. You have to establish the boundaries. Those boundaries cannot be flexible. They can't be elastic, because then I'm now pattern seeking. Okay, so the boundaries would have to be inflexible, and then they would have to fit, and I couldn't be selectively fitting them. So that means that, like the red light example, I couldn't be just stopping at the red lights or remembering that I stopped at the red lights.
Yeah.
I would have to look at elements, and the elements could not be shifting in the story. So when you tell, I find it very problematic when you say, at this moment, I forget who we're talking about, Sarah is the tree of life, and then at this moment, so-and-so is the tree.
Sure.
And it's the same story, but the tree of life person or character or element has changed in the story. This is a problem that is widely recognized with type preaching, typology, when the types change. So they're like, this is the type of Jesus. And then they sin. They're like, okay, now it's not the type of Jesus,
Yeah,
it's the
I hear
type
you.
of someone else. And so then it's like, well,
But-
we have a problem.
But see, that's where I would agree with you and argue against type preaching. I'm not trying to establish types as much as I say that there is thematic unity that can be demonstrated between
But that's a
certain
far,
stories.
I would agree with that far closer, because that is a far cry from what I think you're trying to prove in this study.
Well, I don't.
I agree in thematic unity, and
Yeah.
and I wouldn't even. I mean, I could even argue that thematic unity is because you have a single author, who's Moses, let's say, and I'm talking about the human author.
Sure.
And so I could say we can argue thematic unity because you have a single author, thematic unity because you have a single objective, which is to get from creation to the people of Israel, which is, I think, is the purpose of the story, is the overall arch, is saying this is where Israel came from. And so all of that would bring, and you have a common language is written in and a very reduced vocabulary. So that's one of the things also. You say, well, I find these same words over and over and over. It's, but they have an extremely reduced vocabulary, right? I mean, you look at the New Testament is like 4,000 words total. That is like nothing. So when people say, hey, I found the same word in a bunch of chapters, it's like 60% of the New Testament is the same 130 words. That's not meaningful that I can see. It's not, you know what I'm saying?
I get what you're
so
saying.
I can see I could argue, but I wouldn't even argue. I'm just saying it's possible. But I wouldn't even argue thematic unity from that view. I would accept that and say, I think Moses did have a thematic unity. But did he iterate the stories and pile them up so that the last story was giving deeper meaning than what could be gleaned from the first story? I don't think you've proven that case. Let Nolan in on here.
Well, I was just going to say what you were saying was basically what you were trying to say was making like a mold of something and trying to fit those things into that mold. You can't change your mold later because then...
I have a problem. To me, it's problematic. I'm not establishing a hermeneutical rule for everyone else. I'm just saying when I look at it, if the mold, like you're calling, which is a good word, if the mold is constantly changing in shape and size, then it's like, well, then I'm not finding patterns. I'm just changing the mold. And I find you do that too often for my taste.
Okay. That's
we have a couple questions real quick. Let's look at these. Abigail Culper, I'm assuming you know who that is? Okay. Abigail Culper asks,
Kuiper.
That's an
Abigail
I.
Kuiper.
It's Kuiper.
Kuiper. Yeah.
Sorry about that, Abigail. I'm going to just say Abigail because I don't believe anything Josh said. I'm joking.
That's true.
I doubt everything he says. Okay, she writes, what's wrong with looking for patterns? Oh, she says it's okay. Thank you, Abigail. What's wrong with looking for patterns? How can you ask one direction but not also think the inverse? I'm not sure what that means, so I'm just going to go with the first one. She can explain that.
I think I get what she's asking.
You understand the second one?
I think I understand her question.
Is it related to the first one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, she's basically just asking the inverse question. She's saying, what's wrong with looking for patterns? So you're trying to say, like, hey, you shouldn't just be looking for patterns everywhere. She's saying, what's wrong with, if there are patterns, looking for them? So I would say she's asking.
Okay.
So
basically, it's the same question. So what's wrong with looking for patterns? I wouldn't say there's anything wrong with looking for patterns. I think that we have not established, as far as I can tell, and I've done some research on this. I don't think that anyone has yet established a methodology that I feel does not enable them to find what they want to find. So any methodology that constrains you but not me is not a methodology that I would accept for myself, because then that's what I find. People say, well, I use this methodology, and I hear what they say, and then I'm like, well, that only constrains me. That is built, that methodology was designed to make all your pattern seeking appropriate or accurate, and everyone else is wrong, which is a problem I have with that. It's like, it's like I find all these patterns. Okay, fine. Now I found a pattern. Oh no, yours doesn't fit. Well, why not? I mean, other than that it disagrees with your pattern, why doesn't it fit?
Yeah.
But there's no methodology to say that. So this is my issue with this when we look at this. Now, if it's the study where we're saying, man, I see all these parallels and I see all these patterns. Oh, that's very interesting. Okay, fine. Whatever. That's
sure.
It's interesting, and I'm intrigued. That's why I listened to it. I wasn't just prepping for the show. I was intrigued. I'm like, I want to hear this out. This is something different. I love to hear things different. If you've listened to my show, you know I love to hear things I don't agree with.
Sure.
That's all I listen to. It's stuff I don't agree with. So I listen to yours a lot. I want to tell you.
Good.
You take that for what it's worth.
It. Yeah.
I did. I enjoyed it immensely. Still listening to it.
Good.
Okay. So that's one thing. But then we say, okay, now this has meaning. There's a reason for this, and it's doing something. And what it's doing is the last stories are illuminating the first story, so you can take the details from the last story and you read them into the first story, and now you know something about the first story you would not have known otherwise. Okay, now we've gotten serious, and you don't get to do that without methodology.
Fair.
Okay, and so this gets us to where I wanted to go on this issue, which is where I really start having more problems with the view.
I know
and
where
you
we're
know where
going.
we're going
Yeah.
with this. So talk to me, and I want you to tell me and explain it to me, and maybe the way I heard it in the study is changed, or maybe I didn't. Maybe I didn't understand it properly. So I want you to tell me. In the study, you say a couple things. One is the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil are the same tree. You say they're not real trees, and you say that they're metaphorical for that they killed an animal and drank the blood or ate the blood or whatever. They consumed blood.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about that.
So here's where I started when I was thinking of studying the book of Genesis like this. And again, this was not how I had started teaching the text. I mean, I taught through already up to chapter 12 before I really became aware of this pattern, which caused me to do exactly what you said. Say, and this is a little graphic.
Okay.
That I think it helps.
Or
And I
which
don't know if you
camera are
can
we on?
show it or.
Put it
I
on,
think we're
put
better.
it on
Yeah,
this.
let's put
Yeah,
it
put it
on.
on this one, so I can just show what we're
Okay,
talking about.
coming to me.
So just so we can see it. So how I understand
You look
that-
better like this.
Yeah, I probably. Yeah.
Sorry.
So anyhow, what I was trying to show is that there are multiple different stories in the text, and that we find little patterns like this that go down. For
Right.
instance, in story A, we would have A, B, but no C, but a D, E, and an F. And when you get to story B, you'll notice a B, a C, no D, but an E, and then so on and so forth.
Yes.
So this is what I noticed when I was going through the text. I wasn't saying that every single story had every single component of Genesis chapter 3 in it, but that if you took Genesis chapter 3 as your model, you would find the most filled out form, but with a few holes. That if you read some of the other stories, you could come back and read details back into
I understand. I understand
but
the
just
hypothesis.
just
Okay.
so that they understand what I was saying.
Okay.
So
Real quick,
Go
just
ahead.
let me close the loop on Abigail Kuiper.
Kuiper.
She says, but you said you have hesitancy in seeing patterns. Absolutely, hesitancy, but I don't think they're wrong. I would not go to say seeing patterns is wrong, which was the question, Abigail. What I said is I'm hesitant to do so, and I'm hesitant to accept them because of the problems I see in them. Right?
Sure,
Okay.
sure.
So,
Okay.
anyways, go ahead. I just wanted to make sure so that she's answered.
Okay, so now going back into the most controversial part of the study, which it's a shame that it's at the beginning. I should have put that at the end so that people would listen to it and have a chance to get. But yeah,
It's actually not the most controversial to me,
Okay.
but to me, the whole methodology is what's the most controversial.
just
okay.
All right, fair
But
enough.
for many, I assume it probably is.
Fair
so
enough.
let's talk about it because
So-
it's interesting.
Okay, yeah, so I think it's interesting too. So basically, what I started to do when I was coming back into reading the beginning story in light of all of the other stories is I just began to ask some particular questions. And again, I don't want to rehash the whole entire study. Just go listen to Bereshit chapter
Yes.
1. And
Don't do that. They can listen.
Yeah, they can listen to. But basically, I was trying to ask, what is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right?
Okay.
And is it a literal tree?
Okay.
And I'm trying to make the case that the name of that tree indicates to me that it's not a literal tree. Because I can go outside, I could talk about an apple tree, I can talk about a pear tree, I can talk about a peach tree, all of these things you understand. But if I say go outside and pick me a fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you look at me kind of funny. Or if I say, go get me a fruit from the tree of life. Again, there are no trees that, at least in our world right now, are trees of life. And I'm talking about literal trees of life, right? Or literal trees of the knowledge of good and evil. So I began to, again, look at the structure of the book of Genesis and try to ask questions about the structure. And what I noticed was Genesis chapter 1, you find a very heavy emphasis upon the word good, right? That God is creating, and he's saying, this is good, this is good, this is good, this is good. This is very good, finishes out creation. When you get to the end of the Torah portion, which is in Genesis chapter 6 of Bereshit, which is like the old way it was do I know you hate chapters and stuff, but these are actual old divisions.
No, I
Yeah.
don't hate chapters. I hate verses.
Well, same. Okay, whatever.
Well, I want to be clear.
Clear, okay. So, when you get to chapter 6, you find what God is doing is he's looking at his creation once again. But now he's saying it's evil. And he says that the world's filled with evil and that man's heart is filled with evil and he's going to destroy it. And so I just thought that was interesting that here in the middle of the Torah portion, we have a tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But in the Torah portion itself, we find good in creation on one side of it, and we have evil and destruction on the other side of it. And I thought, could this play into what the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is? And so I began to look elsewhere. And I think the whole Torah is once again a reiteration of the initial story. And so you see the children of Israel, like Adam and Eve, a new creation of God, they're on the border of the land of Canaan, and they're about to go in. And what Moses is doing is he's saying that I'm setting before you life and good and death and evil. And in the studies, I point out quite a few other instances where you see characters saying things like, am I in the place of God to kill and to make alive? Or
Okay, so I understand. So now explain to me how that means that the tree are not literal.
So again, going back into the exact expression, tree of life. So for instance, we speak of branches of science or family trees or
No, I understand.
different. So just bear with me that we sometimes use tree language
absolutely.
to allude to things that aren't.
But
that are not literal.
what is there? Give me a specific how I would look at this and say, because I want to start there because that's actually the least controversial part of all three of those. Of the three elements, that they're not literal trees is the least controversial. It's actually pretty widespread view. And I'm not saying I disagree with that they're literal or not literal trees. That's not my point right now. To me, it's I don't want to get into that. So
Okay.
I just want to test your.
Sure.
Okay. So you need to explain to me or to give me something specific that tells me these are not literal trees. The fact that the word tree can be used metaphorically does not mean those are metaphorical trees.
I would say knowledge of good and evil is not something that you eat.
But how do you know that? I mean, let me give you an example. So this is one of the real issues I took. I thought you did a bang-up job on most of the class. But I thought when you talked about the tree, you were at your weakest point.
And it was my most speculative point. So
Yeah, and it was your weakest way of dealing with it. So you're like, I can't go out in the yard and get a fruit of life. Well, just because you can't go out in your yard and see a dinosaur doesn't mean there weren't dinosaurs. See, you're using what is now with what could be there. So the idea that you're saying that there could not have been a tree that had fruit that actually, now that we know that old age is actually a count in your telomeres of your DNA code, that there is not a organic compound that God could create that could medicinally fix senescence, old aging. I don't find that to be far-fetched.
okay, I mean,
Because what if they come up with, let's say that science comes up with a pill that you can take and you no longer grow old. Because cancer is that. I don't know if you know that, but cancer is immortality.
cancer is immortality.
Cancer is immortality.
Okay, try to
Well,
just,
okay, because cancer is your own cells reproducing excessively.
okay.
They just keep going and they don't quit reproducing. So you get tumors. Instead of the cell, something sounds weird. Are we okay? Did you change something? I'm like a little bit like weird up in here. No?
Sounds
maybe-
normal to me.
Okay. Maybe it's just my thing is got a little lower battery. I adjusted it.
Okay.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so cancer is essentially immortality. It means that the cells are supposed to reproduce and die, and so they're constantly replacing. When they quit dying, then you develop tumors. Because that's what it is. So we're in a constant, our body is designed by God to be in a constant balance between growing old, which is the cells all dying without reproducing, and immortality, which is dying of cancer. So we're right on the cusp of death from immortality and death from old age. Okay? So what if science comes up with a pill that you can take it and your cells no longer stop reproducing themselves, which means you never die? That's what that would mean.
Okay, so do you think that science could come up with a pill and that we could take it?
Theoretically,
And,
yes.
well, no. I mean, for
Yes.
real, they could come up and then people would never die.
Yes. I think that's entirely possible because
See, I would say it's not
but the-
possible because sin is what kills people. people die because of sin. Death is a result of
No,
sin.
that's
Yes.
it. That now we're into theological discussion.
But I mean,
no, let me finish.
I'm not here to talk science. I'm here to talk
But
theology.
that's not. I understand.
Okay.
But what I'm telling you is that is a theological discussion. What I'm telling you is that the tree of life, that you're saying the tree of life cannot, because you're saying it cannot exist. That's scientific discussion, not theological. Because you could have a literal tree of life and not a theological tree of life.
But then I think you're making one step removed from what I'm saying, because you're saying this is then a tree that produces a fruit, that then the fruit then produces.
Well, that's what it says.
Well,
You get into Revelation
No,
and
it's
it
not
says.
exactly what it says.
Well, yeah, that's what the text of the scriptures talk about the tree of life. Revelation talks about the tree of life.
Proverbs also talks about the tree of life.
Yes, it talks about it in a very metaphorical sense. But Revelation, I'm not saying that. I told you, trees can be used. The word tree and the idea of the tree of life can be used metaphorically, and it is in places. Revelation deals about a tree that is in the New Jerusalem, whose leaves are for the healings of the nations.
Again, and I would say if you look at Revelation chapter 1, that it was a revelation that God gave to Jesus Christ, which he sent and signified by his angel unto his servant John, which he sent and signified. He put it into signs. The whole book of Revelation is signs. You have beasts coming up out of water and horns and this and that and women standing on the sun and moons behind. I mean,
I understand what you're saying.
I would say I'm not going to accept a hyper literal interpretation of the book of Revelation and how it uses the tree of life when Revelation chapter 1 interpreted literally says that the whole book is a book of signs, that it has significance to what it's saying, that it's a sign. All of what it's talking about is that.
But what I'm telling you is, I understand what you're saying.
So again,
But-
if I were
but
to
what
go,
I'm
but hang on,
saying
one
is-
more thing. So if I could go back to the only other place where we have the tree of life being used, and it's not like we find the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in a lot of other places. You really don't. But you do find the tree of life used in the book of Proverbs, I think 3 times, and it's always referring to wisdom, or it's always metaphorical. It's not talking about a literal tree. So if I were to say,
But you understand
okay.
how metaphors develop. Metaphors develop because there is a physical element behind them.
And
Otherwise, it's not a legitimate metaphor.
I don't disagree with this. For
So
instance,
if we didn't
I
have
say a
literal
family
tree, right? If we didn't have literal trees to look at, then the metaphor of a family tree would be absolutely meaningless.
I'm with you.
So but then by definition, then we have to say there's some reality to the tree of life. Now, I am arguing devil's advocate right now. I'm very little concerned if it was a literal tree. What I am saying is that what my point was, I want to get back to my point.
Sure.
My point is, I found that to be a very weak, that's that thing. Anyways, I find that to be a very weak, the very weakest point of your thing, because you're making an argument that I think is too easily disproven.
Okay.
Because I can very easily conceptualize a tree designed by God that is medicinal to old age, because we know what causes old age. Old age caused by your telomere shortening and your cells ceasing to reproduce at the rate they should to keep you young. That's why you can be youthful for a long time and then all of a sudden start looking old.
Okay.
And that's just how old age works. And we know that it's a physical attribute that can be undone by medicine and other types of physical things like exercise and getting out in the sun more. There's a number of things that can undo it. So all my point is that to say that it's impossible for this to be a literal tree.
Okay, number one, I'm not saying it's impossible that it's a
you
literal tree.
You do when you mock it.
But okay, I let me say this. I'm not
Okay.
saying it's impossible that it's a literal tree. I just think there's more to the view that it's not a literal tree. And again, don't get me wrong. I don't want people to walk away with saying, I don't think this really happened. I
understand
I mean, that's the last thing I want people to think. That's not
no,
where I stand.
you make the tree to be something else literal,
Yes, I make the tree to be something else literal.
which isn't in the story.
Well, I would say it isn't explicitly in the story. And again, I say it's not in the story because we read back into the story from
Right.
the other story. And again, if you reject this way of looking at Scripture, then I'm not going to be able to convince you.
Well, if
otherwise.
I reject it, but I'm not rejecting. What I'm saying is I find it very, very difficult to see. So you can absolutely prove it to me. You can absolutely convince me of it. I'm not closed to it.
Yeah.
Okay, that would be rejecting it. I'm not closed to it, but I do not see that you have made that case at all.
Okay.
And I'm more than willing to hear you make the case, but you got to have to make it kind of quickly.
I don't know if I'll be able to make it real quickly, but I mean, at least one scripture that I wanted to talk about. Let's talk about
Okay.
in 1 Timothy 6, talking about God. It says, who alone, talking about God, hath immortality, dwelling in the light, which no man can approach unto, whom no man hath seen, can see, to whom be honor and power everlasting. So who alone has immortality? Who? God and a tree, apparently.
No, but the tree of life is an immortality.
Well, then I don't understand. So if this,
Okay, so this is a good
if
question.
If this
So-
tree dies, right? So if this tree does not exist forever, and it has to do with science and cells reproducing and
Okay, but let me explain where I'm coming.
But do you get where I'm headed?
No, I
in terms
understand,
of,
but
like,
this is actually old hat for me on this discussion.
Okay.
So I've had this discussion on other issues because of my views on original sin. I've talked about this ad nauseum with other people. So this is actually a very important passage. The tree of life is not immortality because you have to keep eating it.
Okay.
You have to keep eating it. Let's stipulate.
Okay, so no,
let's stipulate that there is an actual tree of life.
I don't know if I can go with that right away because you say you have to keep eating it, because it appears to me like at the end of the story, God is saying, "Now lest man stretch forth his hand and take and eat and live forever." That it's God is worried because it's just a one-time thing. If he could simply
no, it's not. I don't even think the language of the text would say that. It's ongoing. It's present perfect in that they have to be eating it to do it. So this, and again, this is how I see it. Let me explain it to you, and then you can debunk it. So this is how I understand the tree of life. It is fun. This is how I understand the tree of life. The tree of life is an actual tree. I think it was an actual tree that had an actual fruit.
Is it still around? No. Is it still around?
No, of course not.
No, there's no trees of life anymore?
I think the flood wiped it out. There is only one tree of life. I don't think it's a tree that propagates, and I don't think it's around anymore.
Okay, but again, this is a lot of assuming.
Sure.
Okay, fair
Fine.
enough. Fair enough.
And if we found a tree of life, if science came up with a compound, which would come from nature, that undid old age, and as long as you took that compound, you didn't grow old and you didn't die, I would say they found whatever it was the tree of life was.
Interesting.
Because science the idea that medicine is like conjured out of nowhere is silly, right? So now we have medicines that can take away headaches, and they're just simple compounds that come from plants, come from different things, organic chemicals. They put them together, and they come up and they figure out ways to undo things that we used to think could never be undone. Okay. So if they could come up with one, and they know what they're looking for, basically, is because they can do it with some things. If they can elongate the telomeres and keep them from turning into cancer, because that's the problem, then they undo it. And if they could do that, and they say, "Hey, we put together these compounds," I would say they've basically recreated the tree of life. But you'd have to continue to take that. That's not like it's not immortality. Only God has immortality. So this goes to the question. So we'll get your take on this because it's a little off subject, but I'd like to hear what you say.
Fair.
So the question is, could Adam have died before he sinned?
I mean, I don't know. Again, this is hard because I look at things textually, and like I'm only studying the text and trying to get answers from the text and using the text.
I understand that, but
so this is a hypothetical
It is.
question that like there's no possible way I can answer this.
Sure, it is. You can answer it. You're not going to be held to anything. It's just a hypothetical
But
question.
I'm trying to say I have no other resource beyond the text to know anything about Adam and what Adam's life was and these sorts. So it's like it doesn't give me that information. I feel strange speculating upon whether Adam could have died or could not have died.
Well, because when people say that Adam was immortal, because they say that.
Yeah. I don't think Adam probably was immortal. I think the tree of life was there for him to get to and eat and live forever. But again, I think the tree of life is God. I think that's it. I think Christ is the tree of life.
Literally? In other words, he was actually standing in the garden, and they went to him and touched him, saw him, what?
Again, I would say, for instance...
And then you have a problem with a pre-incarnation ideology.
Sure.
So now how is that not speculative?
Well, again, I don't know. I mean, we have to speculate.
Well, then speculate on what I'm asking you. Could Adam have died before he sinned? Because many people don't think he could have. They believe he was immortal.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think he was immortal.
I don't either.
Before he would have ate from the tree of the knowledge.
Before he sinned, before sin, I do not believe Adam was immortal. I believe Adam had access to the tree of life. but he was never immortal because only God is immortal, which means by immortal, and this is what I think people don't understand. They're like, let's say Adam could not have died. Just stipulate. Let's just postulate. Adam could not have died, no matter what. If he quit eating, he would not die. If a boulder fell on him and crushed him, he would not die. If he got locked under a lake of ice, he would not die. He could not possibly ever die, right? People think, well, he's immortal. That's not immortality. Immortality means you have inherent life in you. No matter how Adam could not have died, whether it's looking at Christ, eating of a tree, God just not allowing it to happen. God ordering all events so that nothing could ever happen to him that would put him in a position to die. None of that is immortality.
Okay.
Because he's dependent on God to not die.
All right.
Where God is immortal, meaning, because you read the passage, when God says God is immortal, what it's saying is he depends on nobody. He's self-sufficient cause of life.
Absolutely.
That's the difference. So when you ask me about that, that's my short answer.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Anyways, continue.
So, I mean, I don't know how to get back into this.
So like I said, I think I made my case of why I think.
Well, hang on. I want to at least just because it was.
But I want to go to the other two.
Okay, it was just because this kind of at least bears on something you mentioned earlier, and I think I talked about it in one of the Noah studies. But you remember the story about the man with the withered hand with Christ and stuff, and he's like, "Oh, will he heal on the Sabbath or will he not heal on the Sabbath?" And it talks about, Christ ends up asking the question, like, is it lawful to do good and save a life, right, on the Sabbath, or is it lawful to do evil and take a life? I'm paraphrasing, but if you read it, you'll see that's what it says. And then what does he ask the man to do? He asks the man to stretch forth his hand towards him, which I would say this is another one of these stories where, like, I think that's all of this literally happened, and the story was told this way, but it was told this way and it happened this way because Christ is trying to show that he is the tree of life in this story,
Okay, so here's
that's
what
just an example.
I understand. That's a good example. But here's what I would say about this. And that is that I think you are taking what is very arguably well argued, could be very well argued to be a good metaphorical representation of the Garden of Eden. I think that's perfectly fair argument. Say, look at this pattern, right? You have good and evil, and stretching out his hand and this stuff, and it's like, see how look at that. There's a pattern. Like, oh, that's true. That's very interesting. Okay, well then that means that the tree of life doesn't actually exist. Now that's where I'm talking about the smuggling.
Okay, well I'm not arguing that there wasn't a tree of life, that there was life. I think that the tree was life, and I mean eternal life. Like it was God. It was that relationship with him.
But it wasn't. No, because God cut them off from the tree so they wouldn't live dead, if you will, spirit. Even though these are not necessarily terminology I agree with, but fine. That they would not live condemned forever, physically. The tree of life is about physical life, not spiritual life.
See, I don't know if I would agree with that. I would say it's,
well, I know.
I would say it's both. That it's about physical life and spiritual life. That eternal life is
no, because even if you say it's Christ, it can't.
Let me finish this thought.
Fair enough.
So that it is that relationship with God in obedience. That was eternal life. That they were cut off from that. They had the ability to know God in the beginning, to walk in His ways and do what He commanded, and that would have produced life in them had they done it. But the moment they don't do that, they cut themselves off from God, off from
okay, but here's the problem. Okay. And this is, again, where we start seeing where I'm talking about, where you start getting your patterns, you start making them fit what you want them to fit. They did not cut themselves off from the tree of life. God cut them off from the tree of life. That doesn't fit the narrative.
I'm just speaking loosely.
Well, but that's the problem with patterns. And that's, again, another issue I have with pattern seeking. That people speak loosely when it's convenient.
I feel like I could have said the same thing the other way, that God cut them off from Himself, right? Sent them away from Him, and therefore they lost access to life.
But then that doesn't make sense as a sense of communion with Him. So God cuts them off from communion with Him because they lost communion with Him. It just starts to where it doesn't make sense.
Okay, fair.
So when I look at it, is that we have a tree of life that is, to me, the plain reading of the text is that it is a tree. It's in a garden of trees. It's a tree. I wouldn't have a problem with it being metaphorical. I don't personally. It's like I could see that too. Okay, but it's not Christ. It's metaphorical for physical life that they are losing. So when God says, "The day you eat it, you will die," and then He cuts them off from the tree of life, that's the only death that makes any sense to me. This idea that they died spiritually is meaningless to me because I find Paul saying he was never alive spiritually. Adam was never alive spiritually. When we get into 1 Corinthians, he says that Adam, in his pristine state, was dirt, not spiritual. He says there is a spiritual man and there is a dirt man.
Okay.
And Adam not sinned. He didn't say Adam when he sinned. He said he's dirt because he was made of dirt, is what Paul says. So Adam in his pristine state is not a spiritual man. He is only a living body, not a vivifying spirit, is how Paul kind of words it. So the life that the tree gave was not spiritual life. It's carnal life. Okay, so even if the tree is metaphorical, which I don't have a big problem with, per se. That's why I said I don't think it's your biggest problem. My only issue was how you dealt with it. I thought you should have dealt with it more seriously. So what I'm saying is that as we look at the tree of life, we're seeing that this is a tree, whatever it might be, that gives physical life. And when they are kicked out of the garden, they lose access to physical life, and they therefore are dead. Now, they're dead. I know people are going to say, well, they didn't die at that moment. They did. They're like people on death row. They're dead man walking. Every one of us is already dead. You're dead already. If anybody's walking around thinking that their kid might be the one who lives forever, they're mistaken. Everyone's going to come out of the world the same way, right? Laying down, feet first, everybody. And so that is what the tree of life is. Now, explain to me how the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil are the same thing. Forget about whether they're literal. It doesn't matter. So explain to me how they're the same thing.
All right. I feel like I'm not going to be able to do this justice if I can't actually go back and try to make the argument. But again...
Make the argument of what? That they're not literal?
Well, I mean,
I'll stipulate they're not literal.
Okay, but I'm saying like how I came to the conclusion is the important part, because if you don't understand the methodology, then it's not going to make any sense. So again,
well, I think I understand it. It still doesn't make sense.
Yeah,
to me.
I'm talking about to somebody who's not going to listen to the study,
right,
and only hears this right now.
I got you.
Then
no, go ahead.
Okay, so if you understand that the text is laying out good and what?
No, nothing. I just keep an eye on him. Oh, we're good.
All
we're
right,
good.
okay.
He thinks I'm falling asleep over here. I don't know.
Well, are you or are you not? Yeah. So again, there's an emphasis in Genesis 1 on life and good. There's an emphasis at the end of the Torah portion in Genesis 6 on death and evil, right? And so I go through and show a lot of different other places where you see life and death and good and evil. And then make a case based upon the end of Genesis chapter 1:26, when God says, "Behold, I have given you every herb and every tree on the face of all the earth. You can have them," right? That when God says he's given them all plant life, he means he's given them all plant life, right? And this is not going to be stipulated or changed anywhere in the story. So then what does it mean when God puts them in a garden and tells them, like, look, what you cannot have is the knowledge of good and evil. And why can you not have it? Because it's my tree. It's only mine. How do we know this? It's something that's special and unique just to him. I get this by reading all of the other stories where it's almost a wife in all of the other stories. You know, it's Sarah in one, or it's Potiphar's wife, or so on and so forth. You'll see that there's a special type of relationship that God has with this tree, that it belongs to him, and it belongs to him only. And how do we know this? At the end of Genesis 3:22, he says, "Behold, the man has become like one of us to know good and evil," right? So the knowledge of good and evil initially existed outside of mankind, is what I argue. And that's why the metaphor of eating is used, because it was external to them. And when they eat it, they bring it into themselves, right? So now they have it. And that's why God looks down and says, "It become like one of us now to know good and evil." So if knowing good and evil, based upon all of these chapters together, is the ability to create, right, or to destroy, then it makes sense to me why every other story in the book of Genesis takes these two themes, which is a sexual relationship or a murder, right, or sometimes actually just eating food, and the relationship that is. But you'll see that these become the two main stories and how they get overlaid. Like if you look at Cain and Abel, well, it's a murder. If you look into
No, I know the
Genesis,
stories.
so on and so forth. You can go through all the stories and see. All right, so then now I'm trying to just take it seriously and say, okay, if it's not a literal tree, how am I supposed to come to an understanding of what it means? Well, if it is like God, a godlike ability to determine what exists in the world and what does not exist in the world, then I'm looking at Genesis chapter 1:26 and saying the diet that God gave mankind pre-flood is a vegetarian diet, and that the diet that God gives to mankind post-flood in Noah allows him to eat meat but forbids blood. And I make the case and try to show you in looking at them that these texts play off of each other, that when you find Genesis 1:26 and God's talking about mankind and what he can eat, that it's happening in the exact same place as Genesis 9 is paralleling, where God says in Genesis 1, be fruitful, multiply, replenish the earth, and then I've given you dominion over everything, so this is what you're going to eat. Well, that's exactly what he says to Noah. Be fruitful, multiply, replenish the earth. Behold, I've given you all of the plant life once again, and now I've also given you flesh to eat, but you shall not eat the flesh with the blood, right? And that verse right there in Genesis 9 is patterned after the commandment not to eat of the knowledge of good and evil in Genesis chapter 2, which states, right, all of the trees you can eat, but the tree which is in the midst of the garden, which, by the way, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is in the midst of the garden, and the tree of life is described as being in the midst of the garden. Both of them are in the middle of the garden. So anyhow, these two passages play off of each other. You can have all the trees, but not this tree. And then he said, you can have all the animals, but don't eat blood, right? And so, look, parallelism is everything for me in how to interpret the Torah. If you don't accept it, then I'm not going to be able to do it. But I'm telling you how and why I see why I see what I see. So I'm saying, if this is blood in this story, could it possibly be blood in this story, right? And then what I'm going to do is then try to show you in a lot of the other stories, for instance, in the next story, Cain and Abel, what gets drunken is the blood of Abel by the earth, right? And then when you get into Noah, what gets drunken is the fruit of the vine. And then I can show you, in the reiteration with Joseph and, I'm sorry, not Joseph, Jacob and Esau, what gets eaten is a red pottage. Or what happens with Jacob when he's stealing Esau's blessing is they're slaughtering the goats and bringing. And so I'm trying to say that if you stack up a lot of these stories, you'll see that it looks like, if we're just going to say, look, this is the one piece of information that Genesis chapter 3 did not give you, but all of the other stories do give it to you. So again, this is like my missing C in this graph. Mm-hmm. It's in all of the other stories, right? And I'm speaking loosely. I don't mean all of them. That's fine. But it's in enough of the other stories for me to speculate and say, is it interesting to read this idea back into the story and say that what if, like, what brought them down was them thinking they could be like God in determining what lives and dies in the system. And if they killed an animal right there, right, that being like what brought the downfall of the world was that they killed in God's creation. And I try to argue that in the studies that there's something categorically different between, like, if it's pre-fall and you eat a lemon and you eat an avocado, and sure enough an orange was the tree of life and you eat the orange, but you weren't supposed to eat the orange. Well, it's like, okay, there's not something very, very different in these actions, but there is something very different in an action of if you have access to a lot of plants to eat, and then all of a sudden you make the decision that, hey, this little goat right here, or this little sheep, or this whatever, right? I can kill it, and I can eat it, and I can partake of it, and I can do it. And so that being what opens their eyes to a new reality, and this being what causes the death in the next story. And this is where they get their coats of skin. And again, I'm always looking towards the fulfillment in Christ, to say, like, that this was what happened, that this is what was prophesied, that they did, kill something in the beginning. That this is once again a reiteration of the story. And what do we find? We find murder once again. And what
Okay, so here's
I don't know.
okay.
That's real fast.
Right, and
It's not-
that's
it's-
exactly what I understood
all
when
right.
you did it. So it's good you did it for those that are listening, because that's exactly I heard all that,
Sure.
went through that. So there's a number of issues with that. So like for instance, you keep talking about they killed something, but you only have one instance of that in all your stories. The red pottage is not murder, and that it's red could very well be argued coincidental. It's not, to me, that's just not convincing. Noah drinking wine and getting drunk and turning up naked is not murder. I mean, there's a lot. None of these
Again,
stories are this way.
I'm not trying to say that it is murder. What I'm trying to say
Right.
is that if there's a parallel being drawn, that there's a reason for
So-
why the parallel is
So
drawn.
why can't it be grapes like Ruckman thinks?
If it's grapes, it's grapes. I don't have any problem ultimately if it's grapes. But again, I'm saying that if, for instance, you take the breadth of Scripture, and again, it's in the parallels that we learn how to sync things together. Like for instance, I would ask, like, is grapes ever compared to blood? Yes, clearly grapes are compared to blood a lot of times in Scripture. So that if I'm working on a parallel and I want to show that something similar happened, and it was kind of like the same situation. Well, you see Noah drinking of the grapes. You see in Genesis chapter 4, the ground drinking in Abel's blood.
but
Hang
wait
on,
a
and then
minute.
in the book of Revelation, you see the woman riding the beast, and in her hands is a chalice, and it's full of the blood, and it's all, like this is even...
But you understand
all right.
how tenuous that connection, those connections are. The
if-
ones
yeah,
you're giving,
if you-
extremely tenuous.
I don't think they are, but again,
Well, let me make the
okay,
case.
fair.
Let me make the case of how tenuous they are. Noah drinks grapes, wine. Wine is red. The pottage is red. Blood is red. Therefore, the pottage and the blood and the wine, these are connected. And you have a chalice. It has blood in it. Normally, a chalice would have wine that comes from grapes. Noah drank grape. This is the type of connections we're talking about. Some of your connections I thought were good because they were straightforward and they were provable. But the problem is you start getting these type of connections that frankly look like a conspiracy theorist table where they have all these yarn drawn
Welcome
out.
to my mind. So
So you have all these pieces of yarn. You've seen them, right? Like these webs of yarn. And it's like, Bill Gates one time shook so-and-so's hand and that person went over to that room. And in that room at one time 10 years before, they talked about this subject and that subject is, and it's like, what are we talking about? That may work. That may be true about, the Illuminati. But the idea that this is how we're to interpret Scripture, how can this be falsified? You tell me.
well, I'm trying to argue that it's true.
No,
right
but
now,
that's the problem.
Yeah.
So let me give you a little story. You may have
asking.
heard me give the story because I think it's so enlightening, and I'm going to tell it to you and whoever might be listening to that hasn't heard this. But I heard a debate from a Christian and an atheist on the resurrection, and the Christian asked the atheist in the debate, "What evidence would you accept to believe in the resurrection, to falsify your view and say, no, the resurrection did happen? What evidence would you accept?" In other words, how can I falsify your point of view? And the atheist gets up, and his answer is, if Jesus Christ would have raised from the dead and that same day appeared to every single human being on the planet, not just the known world, on the planet, I might accept that. You understand the problem with that view?
Yeah.
It's like he holds a view that he himself doesn't have a methodology by which it can be falsified.
Sure.
And that's a huge error. I think it's an error in Christians in all doctrine. It's like if I were to ask you as a Christian, how could I prove to you that Christianity is false? And if you don't have an answer for that, it means you haven't thought about it very seriously.
Yeah.
Now, Paul thought about it seriously. And Paul said, if Christ didn't raise from the dead, Christianity is false. We're the most miserable of men, and we're still in our sins. It's over.
Yeah.
That's game end. That's the end of the game. That's game over. So that was his answer. And I approach the things I believe in the same way now. How can I falsify it?
Sure.
My problem with these connections you're drawing is, and I'm not talking falsifying the entire theory.
No,
I'm
it's-
talking about this particular narrow
Sure.
part. To me, it's unfalsifiable. We have gone from what I think are arguably decent patterns into a world of conspiracy theory and I'm just using the word like
fun.
that.
I like it. I like it.
We're going into a world of conspiracy theory yarn where we're dragging out this yarn all over the place based on colors and words that are similar, might sound the same or whatever. We're dragging them out. You use, well, this word spelled backwards. And when you get into that point, then you've lost me completely.
Sure.
I'm like, no. And the reason isn't because I don't think it's possible. And I want to be clear on this. The reason is because there's two reasons. One is it's not falsifiable. It's absolutely not falsifiable, which is a huge problem. And the other huge problem is it's not repeatable. Nobody can find it again. So this is a problem, and this is an objection or a criticism I would offer you as an objective criticism. To me, much of the study sounds cultish. And I want to try to explain that clearly because I don't want it to be taken wrong. I just don't know any other word to use. Okay. I don't think you're a cult, and I don't think it's teaching that is heretical at all. Okay, that's not what I'm saying. Cultish, what I mean to this, is very specific and very narrow. What I mean is when I look at cultish teaching, and I find it all the time in Christians teaching Christian doctrine. Okay, so it's not just like heretical doctrine or bad doctrine. What I mean by cultish teaching is when you look at cults, they have a certain character that defines them or that distinguishes them. And what distinguishes them is they have a teacher who teaches things that you could not possibly learn any other way. And so the teacher will teach for hours and hours, like David Koresh on end, hours and hours and hours, and teach, right? And people are learning for hours and hours and hours and just like eating it up. And yet they never are able to teach it themselves. And it's very typical in cults if you study cults, right? And so I find that sometimes Christians, we tend to get into doctrines that are that way. And that makes me think maybe they're not right. Because I think that they should be able to be repeatable. So I should not be able to have a secret decoder ring in my head by which I can find something that no one else could ever possibly find. And I think that's where you're at in this exact point. I think you're trying to make the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil meaningful in some way. And the way you're going about it is so convoluted that you're the only one that can ever track down that breadcrumb trail.
That's fair.
So that's where I would encourage you to reconsider and retool this view because it really breaks down right there in my view. Okay. I don't know if you want to add. I'm not trying to get you to come to Jesus moment. I'm just trying to make my case.
No, I'm with you. I think, and I actually appreciate what you're saying. I do like when I want to know. Like I study the text, and I know more than anything that the yarn string, like you said, that's the inside of my mind.
Okay.
So I know that better than anybody else. So I like to talk to people, and I do want feedback.
Yeah. Oh, obviously.
All I'd say though is that I do think the patterns are not they're really there. Like if you just look at the text and say, does Genesis repeat in each one of these stories following this verbal structure? And again, I lay out the verbal structure for you to do. Mm-hmm. I think that you'll say, yep, that's really there. And then I try to do this in all my teaching. Like there's a difference between saying this verbal pattern exists and I think it's meaningful. Then I try to step away from the Bible and say, like, am I allowed to speculate? Am I allowed to tell you what I'm thinking? I don't care whether you agree with me or disagree with me.
So here's the issue, though. Here's the issue with that. Let me stop you a moment. We'll talk about that. So here's the issue here with this: that you say, are these patterns there? And I would say, to some extent, yes. I would think that Moses reused a lot of words, and I think that he edited most of the book. I'm not sure that he's the original author. I think that there's evidence that like Adam wrote a portion, the next guy wrote and actually recorded, and then he compiled from the oral and tradition they had of that, and then he edited it. So then it's his hand on it, actually writing it.
Desmond Alexander. That's what he thinks.
Right. Okay. So that's how I look at it. I don't teach it, but that's kind of my view of it. It's like, but I think Moses' hand is there because we have a clear consistency of linguistic consistency, grammatic consistency, narrative consistency throughout. And so I'm very much willing to say, yeah, there might be a narrative reuse of elements purposefully, right, to accentuate certain elements and to bring them out all the way through and to tie it all together, right?
Sure.
And I could agree to that point pretty easily. You wouldn't have to convince me much to say, okay, I can see that might be the case. Fine with that. My problem is this. You have said, okay, since that exists, then now what that means is I can now interpret the first few chapters based on these because that's what the intent of that was. Now you haven't proven that.
Okay. That's fine.
Say-
Maybe I haven't proven it, but I still
Because
think
proving that there's a linguistic or literary pattern does not prove that the intent of the pattern is to backdate into the original story different things.
And you know what? Like maybe you're right, maybe you're not right. But the question I was asking in the study is that if we have all of these different parallels, and they're clearly parallel, and this is the shape and the structure of them, is it possible to read these back in there? Is it possible?
Right, that's
And
the question.
That's the question.
And that's what you haven't proven.
okay. Fair enough.
So that is my point is you have to actually prove that, and I feel that you've cheated on this because you haven't gotten enough pushback, which is that happens. I'm not blaming you for that. And you've come here to get it, and I hope I've offered some help in that. And so I'm not blaming you for. I'm just saying because you haven't gotten the pushback, I think that you've allowed yourself to cheat and say because I think I've proven the literary pattern, therefore I can just jump to say that the what I think that means is also proven, right? It's not. You haven't proven that to me. I don't think you've proven it to anybody who's objective, where they would say, and it's not that they're disagreeing.
No,
they're
I
just
had
saying,
a lot of people disagree.
Okay.
So a lot of people have,
Well, I'm not even saying to who disagree. I'm just saying, even if I myself were amenable to agreeing wholeheartedly with everything you're saying, I would still tell you, you have not proven that is what that literary pattern would even mean.
Okay. Fair.
That has not been proven. You have to prove that literary pattern, and I don't know how you would go about proving that. I don't know how. But I would know this. But my point is this then. I would not accept in any way any type of putting elements, because there's a number of things you have to prove, but putting elements from the latter stories back into the first story as being the right direction. Because how do we know it's not supposed to be the other direction? Assuming we prove that the point of this iteration is to insert elements from one story into another story. How you haven't proven that going backwards is the proper direction? Maybe the wine, maybe the pottage was a fruit of a tree. Maybe the drinking of the blood of Abel is drinking wine. I mean, we could put this element from the one story you're saying into any of the others. You're putting the blood back into all of them instead of putting the drinking wine into all of them. And that's what Ruckman does, and I reject his. Ruckman says that what they ate was from the vine tree, and he pulls out some weird verse out of Ezekiel that it's the vine tree. So the knowledge of good and evil was the vine, and they got drunk, and therefore, ergo, independent Baptists, you can't touch alcohol.
Yeah.
Well, I reject that.
Well, I mean, I
Before we keep
go
going, actually,
Yeah.
before y'all get too far ahead, we have a question, maybe a comment from Bethany Kennell.
Oh, good.
Oh,
like
you're
this
in
lady.
trouble now.
I
When
think
are
there
you
a
going
lot
to
of
be home?
I think there are a lot of people who could teach or reteach this. In our Bible study alone, there is plenty. It might seem like it isn't able to you because you are not familiar with it. Once you see the pattern, you can follow it pretty clearly, I think.
So, and I paid her to write that. So
Yeah.
yeah.
No, that's an objective. No, it's a completely fair comment. So let me respond to that. My response to that is that that's not the case. When I say that no one else can do it, I don't mean someone who sat there and listened to it. Obviously, right?
Well,
I'm saying
okay.
that you're not going to take anyone who's going to be able to find that consistently who has not heard it.
So let me try to respond to what you're saying because I think I have a retort that would
Okay,
make sense
sounds
to you.
good.
So you've spent quite a few years honing your skill in interpreting scripture, right? And so, for instance, we talk about the background that we came from and how it's there's a tendency to sometimes extrapolate one verse and make a point off of it. If you could not teach somebody the hermeneutic of like, look, here's how you need to read Paul, here's how you need to read Romans. Here's how he's using Old Testament scriptures to prove his case, and I mean, there's a lot of strange stuff in Paul's writing where you kind of need somebody who's familiar with the book and how to interpret the book to show somebody. So if I were to say, like, to somebody who grew up in our particular background, you give me the meaning of the book of Romans based upon your way of understanding it. And so they might not come to your conclusions if you couldn't instruct them into how to read the book. Does that make sense?
And I understand what you're saying, so I'll respond to that.
Okay.
So,
But again, until you do that, it would be unfair to say, like, well, if nobody knows about chiasms and nobody knows about parallelisms and nobody knows that this is how the Jewish people have read this text for millennia, then you know what? Maybe you would never come to this conclusion.
Okay. So here's how I will respond to this, and I'll start with the beginning of it. I do not believe that any interpretation that it cannot be commonly discovered through normal understandings is legitimate. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean that every single person can do it. I think there's many people who will never be able to understand the Bible because they have limitations that they can't do so. So I don't subscribe to the idea that everyone can understand the Bible. Not everybody can. But I can't be the only one. Okay. So what do I mean by common understandings? They wrote in a common language. There used to be the idea that the Koine Greek, they called it, you all right?
Yeah, just my ears are sore.
Oh,
Okay,
sorry.
but I'm going to keep going.
Okay, that's fine. So there was a common view amongst Christians that Koine Greek was miracle Greek, God Greek, meaning nobody spoke it. It was invented by God because they had no evidence that anybody spoke this Greek, right? Okay. And so then only God spoke it. Then we come to find out when we start really looking around and do some archaeology, hey, wait a minute, this is actually the most spoken Greek at the time. This was the everyday Greek. This was a Greek that everybody spoke. It's Koine, it's common Greek, not God Greek. This is common Greek. And so when they found that out, then it's like, oh, wait a minute. We can go and we can understand this grammatical structure because it's everywhere. It's in every document. It's on wills. It's on every type of thing. Piles and piles and piles and piles of it. And now we know what they're saying. It's so clear. So it didn't require any type of miraculous decoding to understand it. And Paul wrote in that Greek, or used Paul, but the New Testament authors write in this Greek. They use common grammar in that language to do it. They use common expressions, common idioms, right? Because they want to be understood commonly. And the idea that you can have somebody that can only understand it, right? Nobody else can. That was not, and I'm not saying that's you. Yeah. I'm saying the idea that you're going to have that was not how they wrote it. They did not want that, apparently, because they use extremely simple, very common words, right? And then anybody who knows anything about literature, you don't have to know biblical literature because they don't use Bible literature devices. They use common devices that are found everywhere. Chiasms, they didn't invent them. They didn't invent any of these devices. He uses hyperbole constantly. That's not his invention. He didn't create it. It's just he's using common elements. Okay. He quotes pagan philosophers in his sermon, right? So he does these things so that anyone reading it who has this understanding that can get it from anywhere can understand it. So any interpretation of the text that's legitimate in my view must be common. It can't be solely one person having it. So I don't see it the way you think I do. Okay? So when I look at this and I say, and like I said, I'm not, and I want to answer this, I don't know if Bethany understood this of what I'm saying. I'm not saying your entire study's this way. I am saying there's one element of it where we're talking about the tree of life and what the tree of life is, and that it's eating blood and you're going around, you have all these things. That's where you start, woo. And the other ones, most of them, or many of them, are very straightforward. Yeah. And it's like, okay, I don't necessarily, I think I think in many of them you're overreaching, but you're not being, but I could see how anyone could come to this conclusion. It's like, okay, if you do a word study, which a lot of Christians love these, right? They should get right on board with this. I personally don't, but a lot of them do. It's like you do a word study. You're going to find the word head and heel and look, boom, 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 boom. There they are. Yeah. Perfect. Not my cup of tea, but that you have a parallel between Noah coming out of the ark and Adam coming in.
Creating.
That's common. And I know you know that, but this is not like what? Yeah. I mean, that's right. And so you look at that and you say, look at that parallel. you're right. There is a parallel. God basically restored the earth in the same order, right, as it was created. There, absolutely. It's been pointed out many times. Those kind of parallels, I'm all on board with, and others that others haven't seen. I'm not saying they have to be seen by others. I'm saying they have to be. I have to look at them and say, in theory, they can be seen by somebody else.
Sure.
I can't follow down a path that the only way I know the path is you told me the path. I could not have gotten there any other way. Okay. And the second thing you have to talk about is you mention often in your studies and right now about how the rabbis saw these and how they interpret. Well, to me, that's not a positive because I think they interpret this way too much. And I think Christ came and specifically did not do that. And that's what marveled people in his day, that he did not talk like them. He was plain and straightforward. When I said before, we don't have Jesus giving this type of interpretation. I don't think we do. You may see that he talked in the patterns, which is the example you gave me, but that's not the same thing as saying, hey, look, I'm going to show you some patterns. Didn't do that. He's real straightforward in his teaching. Now, you may see patterns in those teachings, and they may be there, and he may have intentionally put them in there, but he didn't ever talk about them. So I find that difficult.
Okay.
Go ahead. I know I
We have
monopolized a lot of
questions.
time.
All right. Go ahead.
Okay.
We should get to those. From Deacon K Gamer K.
All right.
Uh,
Deacon is Abby's son, Abby and Jason's son.
okay. But you would need to corroborate. But you would need corroboration to say it's wine. I'm not sure if any of y'all know what he means by that. I think that's inaccurate.
I think he's talking about when I reference maybe how Ruckman looks at it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe so.
Well, I would agree. They would need corroboration. Why I reject it.
Yeah.
But my point is that I think it's synonymous or analogous with how you're seeing it. So I would say you need corroboration.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah,
I
he
would
says
agree.
sorry. That was for during real time. So basically.
Yeah. So we missed the moment.
Yeah.
Okay. And then I believe you answered this question on define normal understanding. So I believe you kind of went into your definition.
How I
of
see
how you
what would be a normal understanding, correct?
And then he goes, plain and straightforward. His question. Then why did his disciples ask him to explain his parables?
Because they didn't understand him, but that doesn't mean it's not plain and straightforward. And it doesn't mean that he didn't have elements that he purposefully inculcated or suppressed, which is what he said he did. They said, why are you speaking in parables? The reason they asked him why he's speaking in parables is because it wasn't common at the moment, right? He went his first part of his ministry and never said a parable. It wasn't until the Jewish nation or the Jewish leaders rejected him that he started speaking in parables. And then they said, why are you speaking in parables? Why would they ask him that? Well, because he just got done preaching for 2 years and never said any parables. And all of a sudden, in one moment, he gives a whole list of them. It's like all parables. I'm like, why are you doing this? And he says, so that they won't understand, but you will, and I'm going to explain it to you in private.
Yeah.
And so he gives them the explanation of what he means with these parables. But he doesn't give them an explanation to each one. He gives them a key to it, right? Where they can then take the key and apply it themselves, which is, again, what I'm talking about not being cultish in our methodology. So this is the point I would make, and I want to kind of close that because I don't want it to sound like I'm saying what I'm not saying about that. I found myself being cultish in my approach for a long time. And that's why I'm maybe hypersensitive to it. And that I would have teachings that nobody was going to come to except they heard it from me. And the problem is that type of teaching only creates students. It does not create teachers. And I don't like that. I think true teaching, see, you talk about our common background and faith background. And it's true. So one of the problems in our common background is they despise teaching, or they don't like it. They think that teaching, like Bible schools, seminaries, this type of formal teaching, not good at all. And I think they're mistaken. And I think one reason they do that is because they think, well, all these teachers do is they sit around and talk, and then you're just sitting there listening to them, and you're not doing anything. And you never do anything. And that's kind of their view, I think. And it's probably oversimplified. It's probably not exactly fair, but it's kind of how I see it. And I think that in part, they're true. They're right of sometimes. And I think that is an indicator of bad teaching. Good teaching pushes students past the teacher, not holds them behind them all the way. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And I want your teaching and my teaching and whoever's teaching the scriptures to have that character where I'm not just giving you the knowledge, but you can then move past me, right, and do it. And I know that's what you want also.
That's
And I
the
think
whole point. Is
right.
I'm trying to give you the keys. The keys are parallelism. The keys are chiasm. The keys
That's
are
all fine.
And so
and I'm not criticizing the keys that you're talking about. That looking at parallels and looking at these things. That's what I'm talking about at this moment. I am speaking very narrowly
I get you.
about this one point where you're making this, and I think you're meandering off into cultishness, where this point is something that you're never going to be.
fall on my sword for that point. It's
Good.
It really isn't.
Okay, that's fair.
The crux
Which is why
of-
I didn't start
Sure,
with it,
yeah.
and I wanted to deal with your study on a whole. But that's
Yeah.
fair. That's good. Okay, very good. Anything else? Nolan?
No.
Okay.
Oh,
Go
I
ahead.
just want to
Go.
respond to something you said
Sure.
about Christ. So
Sure.
I think the difference in Christ's teaching as opposed to the Pharisees' teaching is that he taught with authority in that what he said, he wasn't basing it upon, okay, in the name of this rabbi who said it in the name of this rabbi who said it in the name of this rabbi who, and there are chains like that in rabbinic literature where, they're coming to decisions based upon long lineages of ideas that were transmitted down orally through generations and stuff. And Christ's teaching was different in that he didn't do that. He didn't base his teaching off of any, in the name of Rabbi Akiva, who said in the name of Rabbi Phineas, so on and so forth, back down through the lineage. That's the difference in Christ's teaching. Not that Christ didn't do midrashic plays with the text. I think they clearly did. I think Paul does. I think you see Paul doing it. I think you see a lot of writers doing it. I think it's all over the place, once you have eyes to see it. And that would be, I get what you're saying about the cultish element, and I don't want that. I don't want to do that. But that's why I constantly, in teaching, and I think if you listen to this, you'll hear me that I'm trying to simply explain a methodology of interpreting the text.
You
I'm
absolutely
not trying to say
are.
only I have the answers,
No.
only I could. I've tried to, and this was my critique growing up. My critique growing up in the background was that they didn't show the work. That they had a text, that they gave me a giant sermon, and I could not figure out how they got from point A to this.
I absolutely understand.
And so to me, that's the one thing I try not to do. That's my cardinal sin is like, don't say how you have this revelation, not show like, man, I've tried to give people all of my work.
Yeah,
and,
absolutely.
And how I've done it. And if you disagree,
and I agree with that.
I'm open to being wrong. I really
Correct.
am. But I think there's a lot to commend it and a lot that I'm more than willing to say, like, look, I know I live out way on the limbs sometimes, and so I need to be reined back in.
And that's and like I said, I want to reiterate, I am not trying to say that's the bulk of what you're doing.
Yeah.
And that it's like I said, it's very narrow. This to me, when you went into there, I'm like, no,
Sure.
Okay, that's not right. Now I'm open to you saying, hey, the tree of life is the same as the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I don't think you can prove that. I think that every evidence you give is proven the opposite, because they ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They didn't eat of the tree of life. It's like, how are they the same?
No, I don't think they're the same. I think one was inside the other. And again, it goes back into the whole hermeneutic. Like, I'm not going to be able to prove the case for you
Right.
if you can't then buy into, hey, the garden becomes paralleled in the tabernacle, and you.
But here's the problem: no longer falsifiable.
I mean,
See, because you're begging the question. So the question is this approach legitimate? Is it legitimate to take what appears to be a pattern in some stories and might be a pattern in others? Might be. And I'm sorry, from my point of view. This is my point of view speaking to you. I say this is a pattern in some stories, Noah. This might be a pattern in some other stories, and maybe in all the others, maybe, okay? That's kind of where I see it. It's kind of like a down like that. Okay, so I have that. Okay, I'll look at that. Okay, and then you're saying, now what that means is, you take these, you stack them all on top of each other, and they tell you something about all the stories because that's what it means. It's like, okay, now that hasn't been proven, but okay.
But again,
Let's
I
look
would
at
say
it.
you have to do it. Like, you have to do the stuff.
That's what I'm getting to, though. But then you're saying the only way you'll know it is if you do it, and I won't do it unless I know it.
Okay, well then.
But then that's begging the question.
Fair enough.
You have to have an argument that proves one point. It can't be drink it, eat it, live it, bathe in it, and then it'll be true. Well, yeah, if I drink the Kool-Aid, it'll be true. That doesn't work. No. It's like buy the house and then you'll love it. Yeah, that's how. Yeah, that's what every salesman says, right? Buy the car and then you'll love the car.
I get your objection, but it's not exactly fair because I'm trying to say that if like you ever like in school, I don't know if y'all had this. We had transparencies. You know, you had like a projector and you could write something. And sometimes teachers have all of the questions on one, and then you'd lay another layer over, and it'd be the answers to all those questions and stuff. You'd see like, okay, hey. Well, I mean, if you're not willing to believe me, like, hey, look, if you would just take this transparency and set it over
But
this
I have set them over.
Okay, fair enough. But I don't think you've set all of them over. And, I mean, there's just a lot in the study. And again, it's not even only Genesis. It's that this pattern goes through Exodus, it goes through Leviticus, it goes through Numbers, it goes through Deuteronomy. It's very difficult to I think, if you're not willing to consider, hey, Moses... You need to understand all of this book in order to understand any of this book, is really what I'm saying. You have to be able to say, look, there's a thematic things happening in this book.
But see, I am willing to accept those points like that.
Yeah.
But that is not the same thing that you're arguing in your hypothesis.
No, I think it is.
No.
That's what I'm trying to argue.
Okay, well, that there is a thematic point to the book is entirely different. I can get to there in many different ways.
We're not using that word in the same way.
Well, theme means that thematic means, and this is how I'm using it, and this is what I think it actually means. So thematic means that there is a common literary theme throughout the book. I accept that in Genesis. I accept that in almost every book of the Bible. In fact, that's a huge part of my teaching of the Bible, is saying, quit looking at verses, quit looking at chapters, look at the book, what is it saying? How is it written? Some books are written in different ways. Your argument is, yes, and the way Genesis is written is that it's a repetition of the story that is meant to be able to take elements from any story and stick them in the other story. Now, that last point, you haven't proven to me.
Okay, so fair enough. Maybe to try to...
But you understand that when you say you're not willing to look at it and say it's thematic, that's not true.
Yeah.
I absolutely... In fact, I'm in agreement that that all these books are thematic. I'm in agreement that there is repetition of elements in them. I'm not in agreement that what that means. And still, you have not been able to tell me in any satisfactory way what it means, other than being able to put eating blood into the Garden of Eden. It's the only conclusion I can find in your teaching on it. I don't find any other grand conclusion. It's the only thing that's particular.
No, I mean, I wouldn't say that.
I'm open. Tell me what the conclusion is then.
The conclusion is...
It can't be Christ because I'm already there.
Well,
there's piling Genesis. Okay, I'm just saying, but piling Genesis. Well, that's where you went when I first asked. Piling Genesis up on top of each other the way we're trying to do, and getting to that Christ is the antithetical hero to Adam. Well, I'm already there. That I don't have to pile Genesis. I could just throw Genesis in the garbage. I don't mean it to me sound, but I could get rid of Genesis and still be there because I got 1 Corinthians, right? I don't have to have Genesis to get there. Okay.
But I mean, how did Paul get there?
Oh, I'm not saying Paul did. I'm saying me.
I know, but I'm just saying
I'm saying is,
Paul had literature that he's basing these
absolutely.
ideas off of.
But do you think he piled Genesis on top of each other the way you're doing it to understand Christ?
I do. Yeah, I think he
with what evidence?
Well, I mean, I think you just look at his allegory of Sarah and Hagar being two covenants. How are you?
That's not proving a point.
Hold on. You got a lot of complaints that you're talking over him.
So yeah, I know. I'm talking over him.
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine.
No, it isn't.
It's his podcast.
No, that's not how it works. Go ahead.
It's your house.
Thank you, Nolan.
Yes, no problem.
That's his job.
Okay.
His job is to tell me when to shut up.
Well, I'm just saying, for instance, you see certain things that Paul is doing in his interpretation that I think we'd be hard pressed. Like, for instance, if Paul was me and you were sitting here and you didn't believe Paul was inspired, you'd probably, have him by the neck saying, no, you can't, do that with the text and make it mean this. For instance, just give an example off the top of my head, like Romans 10, Don't say, who shall ascend into heaven? That is to bring Christ down. Or who's going to, go across the sea or into the abyss? That is to bring Christ up from the dead. There's no way you're going back into Deuteronomy 30, looking at what Moses is saying in context and saying that what Moses means right here when he's talking about the commandments are not too hard for you. Don't say, who's going to go into heaven to get them and bring them down to us, or who's going to go across the sea and get them and bring it. I mean, you would not let that slide. In a lot of Paul's stuff, I don't think you would let slide hermeneutically looking at it. You have to admit that there were ways that they had of looking at the text that they found to be legitimate midrashic ways of using the text, and they had rules for it. And that's why I'm saying, I can't say all of the rules for it, but the rabbis have rules. They're not just pulling rabbits out of hats over and over again. What I was trying to do in the text, look, if you don't like rabbinic interpretation and you're not interested in midrashic understanding of the book of Genesis, then just forget it. Just go along with your everyday life. But if you are interested in some of the ways that Paul would have looked at the text and how he would have been able to get to certain conclusions, why would he see Sarah and Hagar as types of two different covenants and two different mountains and stuff? I mean, you're not looking at Genesis 16 and telling me that's what Genesis 16 is about. There's no way, you can read it backwards, forwards, anyway, You're not seeing that in Genesis 16. So where is Paul getting it from? He's doing these huge loops in the Torah and seeing these stories expand. This is my contention, whether you agree or disagree. But my contention is he's seeing these things play out, and he's able to take stuff that happens later on in history and then read it back into Genesis 16 and play off of these characters and make Ishmael mean something and make Isaac mean something and make the Torah coming out of heaven Christ, and that going across the sea, bringing him up from the dead. I mean, did you get at least?
I do understand what you're saying,
yeah.
and you're making valid points.
Okay.
And
so to me, it's like, look, all I'm doing is just playing with this hermeneutic, and man, it revolutionized my reading of Scripture. I'm just saying personally, It revolutionized it, made it way more interesting, and actually changed my life. So I'm saying, like, I'm different from that study, and it's not about eating blood. It's not about this. It's not about any of this.
I understand.
I mean, like, if you're saying, what's the point? Like, I had a conversation with Stephen Kincaid. He's like, what's the point? What's the point? I'm like, man, my life is different because I saw how clearly my actions play into the next generation.
You understand that.
And that's what I'm trying to get across. That's why it's
Okay.
really important to me that people listen to it, because I think, man, my life, I was going down a direction, and because I saw how clearly it was going to affect my children, I changed, I mean, legitimately changed decisions that I was doing and ways that I was acting and stuff that I was letting slide that I should.
Okay, so here's the issue with that, and then again, this is where I think we get into what I call cheating, and that is that because you are a cheater, that because you have a personal experience from something, that somehow is evidence that what you think brought it to you is legitimate, and it isn't.
Okay, logically, I get what you're saying.
You can, that is not to diminish your personal experience, right? I talk to Pentecostals who I don't think have any evidence whatsoever for their charismatic beliefs, and I've argued with them for years and years, probably more than any other group. I've had debates with the Pentecostals, and they've never been, to my judgment, they have never been able to prove these things they believe, but they all have experiences in them. Now, I don't deny their experience.
Yeah.
I think their experiences are real and mostly positive. So that's great. I'm glad they've had them. I'm glad their life is better. That's all good. That doesn't make it true. That doesn't make it doctrinally true, right? And so when I'm looking at this and you say, well, this has really done wonders for my life, well, I think that's wonderful, right? That's wonderful. But that's personal. It's not collective. It's not something that then becomes evidence that it's doctrinally right. So going back to Paul,
and I don't know if I was making the argument that it
no, you're
was
not. But I want to be clear.
I was trying to say the reason I was saying it was why it's important
to you.
Yeah.
But see, that won't make it important to others. I mean, there's
fair, but it doesn't mean that it won't.
I've had people tell me that they, happened to look up in the sky and they saw a cloud that was shaped like something, and then that told them that they needed to get their life right, and they went ahead and changed their life based on that. I'm not going to tell them, no, that's false. Go back to your bad way of living. I'm like, okay, great. Maybe that was from God. Maybe God used that. I am also not prescribing cloud gazing as a way of finding God. right? Just because somebody found meaning in that, and maybe it's absolutely proper, and maybe, and I'm not even discounting that God actually used it in their life. I'm not saying that. I'm willing to say he absolutely did.
Yeah.
It does not mean that's for everybody. But doctrine is. So doctrine is what we can say is for everybody, and it's not specific to an individual. So I'm not dismissing what it meant to you. I'm just saying has anything to do with whether or not it's accurate or proper or correct. Going back to what you had said.
We have actually, you want me? We
Sure.
have some questions
Okay.
we can actually
All
get
right.
to.
Are they questions or are they more about how bad I am as a host? Because you can just skip those and tell them to me in private.
Yeah, we'll skip that. That's the majority.
That's what I
I
thought.
wrote a couple in there myself.
I know.
Okay, so she's wondering. Bethany Kennell is wondering if you think that that someone's own personal testimony is not important or worthwhile to others.
Sure. I think it's very worthwhile, but it doesn't mean it's doctrinal. I can give you, I have dealt and won a lot of people, Lord. I'm not a very good soul winner. So it just shows how much time I was at it, right? Because I'm not very good at it. But I've won a lot of people, the Lord, and I've heard a lot of testimonies in my life. And I'm amazed at all of them. I believe all of them, even ones that I find doctrinally suspect. I believe them all. And I believe that God does work, and I hate the cliche, but in mysterious ways. Ways which I doctrinally would never think or predict he would.
Yeah.
And I do not discount them. I don't care who it is. I don't discount them. But it doesn't mean it's doctrine.
Sure.
It doesn't mean it's doctrine. And that's all I'm saying. So I'm not doubting or dismissing his personal experience. I'm just saying that is not evidence.
So, just so everybody's clear, what you want from Joshua here is you want a doctrinal reason, right?
Well, I have
doctrinal response on the point of your study. Is that?
Well, like
that
for
kinda
the
what
moment,
you're-
for instance, this brought this up on this particular subject of it is, I do not see a purpose for this. I don't see, it's a tool that I can identify. If I accept that it is a tool, I can't figure out what tool it is or what it possibly does.
It's parallelism, and it
No,
helps
that's not
you-
what I'm talking about.
Yeah, but I'm trying to tell you what I think it is.
I'm
So
not talking about the parallels. That's different.
Okay.
See, this is where we're not connecting. I think this is where we're talking past
over.
each
Okay,
other.
all right.
Not over each other, but past each other, right? Because I believe in parallelism. I see parallels in the Bible also, okay? So I'm not objecting that there could be parallels. And now I don't agree with all the ones you see, but I'm not discounting that there could be parallels and we can look for them and see them and there they are. The point is, are these parallels or are they parallels that you then pile on top of each other and read details into other stories? That's not the same as parallels.
Okay, I know. That's why I was going to make two parts. To
Okay,
it.
I'm sorry.
One is parallelism. Like, that's what I'm really trying to do, and that's what I'm trying to get people to understand when they're reading Scripture is
Okay.
look at it this way and think. Don't read a chapter and forget about that chapter and start a new
I'm
chapter.
with you on that
Okay,
one.
I mean, that's the short end of it. It's like, look, everything you read is important. And how is it important? Because verbally it follows the same structure, which is trying to show you these stories are related to each other. Okay?
I'm with you
So
on that.
I know, that's the basic. So now here's the novel thing, right? And I don't think it's necessarily the novel. The novel is try to let this story comment upon this story and see what you don't see, and vice versa. You know, read this story into this story and that one into that one, and see if you don't come away with a deeper level of understanding.
But how do you judge if you have a deeper level or a wrong level?
Okay, so
What's the methodology? We're back to that. Where do you say, okay, because I could look at any of these stories and you have said, okay, I can put the blood, and I'm just going to use this as an example. I'm not trying to make you fall on the sword on it. I can put the blood from Noah into the garden. Boom. Well, what about everything else? I mean, every single detail goes into the garden,
no,
but then how do we know which one's not?
I mean, what I was saying in the final study is that the initial story is told like a skeleton story. This is what I was coming down to. It was told like a skeleton story. I think something really happened. I think there was really a sin. There was really an Adam, but it's told by Moses in such a way that he intentionally erases details that were there that could have filled it in, so that this story becomes the skeleton that you can lay the Noah story on top of, you can lay the Jacob story on top of it, so on and so forth. The rest of the stories in Scripture can quite nicely fit inside of this story, so that all sins that get branched out, you see how they're just really, once again, a replay.
Okay, so tell me, let's get specific here.
Sure.
That. What did he erase?
Well,
what details?
So look, I think as far as look. So again, if you don't buy into it, I'm not going to be able to convince you. The details he erased is what exactly happened. So the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. What did that look like? What was eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? What did that mean? And I'm just trying to take language seriously and say that if we weren't reading Scripture and you came to any other book and it mentioned the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or it mentioned the tree of life, that you would come to it and recognize pretty clearly, or quickly, rather, that this is a metaphor.
I don't think so.
Well, I think so.
Okay, but you should then be able to convince me that I would look at that.
I think
piece
it's
of
hard to
literature.
convince you of pretty much anything. So this
Fair
is,
enough,
yeah,
but even
I
still,
could convince a rock.
But that's the reason why you need to talk to me,
Yeah,
because
it is true.
Because if I'm easily convinced, then what's the point, right? So here's the deal. I am not a person who is a literalist of the Bible, and I think you know that. I look at the Bible, and I look at the Bible as literature, and I'm looking, and if I think it's hyperbole, then I identify that. So when Paul says, if I speak with tongues of angels, that is hyperbole. There are no such thing as tongues of angels. I certainly don't have them. Yeah. There is no such thing as tongues of angels. He's not setting out a new doctrine that there are tongues of angels. That's all nonsense. He is speaking hyperbole. He does it often. It's easily recognizable. It's a common trope. It's a common literary device. He uses it.
Sure.
Okay? I have no problem doing that.
Okay.
But I look at Genesis chapter 1. I find no evidence to say, because if that tree is metaphorical, all trees in the story are metaphorical.
No, that's not true.
How can you possibly say that? Because there's no indication for it to be metaphorical.
See, this is where I think there's clearly an indication for it to be.
Okay, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Make that case.
So again, I think I've probably already made it. I don't think you.
No, I heard it, and I don't think you made it.
I don't think you agree with it, but I think when he says, "Out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight." Yep. Every tree that is good for food. Yep. The tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Those two expressions right there, I think, are categorically different from pretty trees and fruit trees or food trees. Trees of life. I mean, look, an apple ain't going to do for you whatever the tree.
But he doesn't say it's an apple.
No.
The text actually.
I didn't say it was an apple.
I know,
but
I know.
I'm saying that an apple, right? Like, look, you're saying if it's a literal tree, right? It's the same thing as if it's an apple, except it just does something with telomeres, right? I mean, I'm
just giving you a possible explanation.
Okay,
I'm not saying that's my
explanation.
explanation.
I'm just
okay.
Yeah. So look, it's just a fruit, but it does something with your telomeres. But it is just a strawberry, or it's an apple, or it doesn't matter. It's any other fruit tree that's a literal fruit tree that they can take, right? I mean, that to me is. I lost my train of thought. So.
Right, the point.
Yeah.
But let me respond to this. This is the thing. He says God made all these trees, and He made the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil.
I remember what I was going to say.
Okay.
I mean, the effects of these two trees, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life, are so drastically different than any other possible tree that you and I can think of in our world. Okay, now look, maybe there might have been magical
But let me
trees,
respond to that. Let me respond to that though. If we're saying, like you said, we're just looking at this as literature. I read a lot of books. I've read a lot of books, of fiction books. There is no fiction book I would read that I would then say, the author is meaning for this to be taken metaphorically in that sentence. There's no way.
Life is not a fruit.
No, but you're talking.
Knowledge of good and evil is not a fruit.
Hold on a second.
Right? But I mean, is that right or
hold
wrong?
On. Look, that's arguable, but that's not the point.
Is life a fruit? Is knowledge of good and evil a fruit?
It's not the point.
But it's precisely my point.
No, it isn't. That's not fair, because you said.
How? Okay.
Let me finish.
All right, fair enough.
You said, if I were to read this story in any other literature, I would clearly understand that those are metaphorical.
It's in a different category, is it not?
No. Let me finish.
Okay.
you said, if I were to read this story in any other literature, it would be I would clearly know it's metaphorical. I'm telling you, I have read a lot of literature. That phrasing, I would not think these now are metaphorical trees. Forget what they are, it doesn't matter to that argument you made. We're not talking about the tree of life and tree of knowledge of good and evil in a doctrinal sense or theological sense. We're talking about this as a written story in any piece of literature. If Jack London would have written that, if Edgar Allan Poe would have written that, I would not have said, oh, there is a real, literal, physical garden that has real, literal, physical trees, but these two trees aren't actually real or literal or physical, and he's meaning these to be understood somehow metaphorically. I wouldn't see it that way. The only way I can see it that way is presuming it to be that way, or saying that somehow later on it says it's that way. But reading that story, I would say an author has conceived in his imagination a typical, ordinary garden in which there is something that is physical, like a wardrobe, that you enter into it literally, physically, and you go into a land of Narnia. That is a perfectly, in fact, that's kind of where he got the story, right? Is kind of from this whole idea. But that wardrobe in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is a wardrobe in the story. It's actually a built wardrobe out of wood that you go in, you transport to Narnia. It is not a metaphorical wardrobe. It is a real wardrobe. So that's how I'd read that story.
Okay.
So I don't see, you're not, this is where I'm saying is where the weak, I'm not trying to debunk.
I'm okay. Like if you just, but to me, I'm just saying,
Right.
as I'm reading it, I mean, when it says every tree that is pleasant to the sight, it's like that's a category of trees. We have pretty trees. Every tree that is good for food, that's also true. That I know this category of trees.
Okay.
And then he says in another category, like, so this is not in the category of a pretty tree or a tasty tree. Also, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the midst, right? And the tree of life. And, I'm not going to go into any other argument, but there's a lot of other ancient Near Eastern literature that uses these sort of, symbolisms and ancient trees and different stuff and what they do. So it's not unheard of in terms of...
like I told you at the beginning, the idea that these are metaphorical is not uncommon.
Okay, but what I'm saying is, like, these are categories. These are clear categorical statements. Pretty trees, tasty trees, and here's a new type of tree, a tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And here's a new type of tree, a tree of life in the midst of the garden. So it's like, okay, I'm just asking why you put it in this category. Why these categories right here? These two trees are totally different than what we're talking about. And again, like for instance, when I read the book of Proverbs, I read Proverbs as if it's commenting on the book of Genesis, or not Genesis, just the Torah, over and over. I read Proverbs as if every one of these little pithy wisdom statements are an actual small commentary on some passage in the Torah. For instance, a righteous man falls down 7 times and rises again. Jacob goes to Esau and he bows himself 7 times. He's commenting on this story. Or for instance, say to wisdom, you are my sister. That's Abraham and Sarah. He's calling Sarah wisdom in the story. He has an allegorical interpretation. And to keep you from the strange woman. Hagar means the stranger. So I think Solomon is commenting on the Torah and he's giving you insights into it. And so Solomon, when he's using the tree of life, I think he's commenting on Genesis chapter 3, and he's not using it literally. So I'd say Scripture looks at this and interprets it allegorically in the book of Proverbs. I'm not going to look at Revelations because I already explained it, but Proverbs is doing it. And again, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is not used elsewhere, but the expression good and evil becomes used multiple different times throughout the book of Genesis, right? And in most of the instances, it's somebody's life on the line, Joseph saying, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. Or Jacob coming to, Laban coming to Jacob, and God saying, don't say anything good or evil to him. You know what I mean? Basically. And he said, I would have done you harm, but God told me not to do. And so, like, again, you have to take all of these stories and see, like, oh, well, this is true in this case. Now I just have to assume it's not true in this case. Or I can say it's true in these other 5 cases that this is what it means. is it possible that it means that in the initial case? And that's what I'm speculating on. And again, I'm not gonna
I agree.
I'm not
agree
gonna
that
fall on my sword.
No,
and
I
say,
understand. I agree that that's what you're speculating on, and that's what you're speculating on throughout the study.
Yes.
And this is where I'm saying that, as far as I can see, and obviously, we're not going to agree that on the assessment, and that's fine. But my assessment is, as much as I look at it, as fairly as I've tried to look at it, I do not think you've made the case of this. Now, I'm not talking, and I think you've mixed it. And I think this is a mistake. I think you've mixed it up and, like Play-Doh, squished it together of the parts that are obvious, where you find like Noah and the revealing or the restructuring of the world in the same order as the creation. That's like a real obvious one, and so that's an easy one right there. It is. Okay, boom. And then you got some that are a little less obvious and a little less obvious, and you've made those. And those are like, okay, I can be on board with that. And on the idea, I am like seeing. If there's parallels, they should be recognized and acknowledged. I'm completely on board with that, okay? But then you've taken that and meshed that together with what is the proper use of that tool? Mm-hmm. And your view of the use of the tool is that you pile them on top and then you let the elements of all the stories bleed together, but I think you do it selectively. And that, again, is a problem I have, because it's like, well, why not this element? And why not that element? And why not the other? Why aren't they all bleeding? And why don't we have one huge brown story with all the colors bled together? Why is it so selective, right? And then why are there so many elements that don't? And there's just so many questions that I don't feel are answered. Okay. And I know this is ongoing. I know you're in progress, right?
Yeah,
so this isn't like
progress.
right. So I'm not trying to like think I'm giving a final pronouncement.
Look,
this is an ongoing commentary of where I think you're
This is the most valuable conversation that I've had, because it's given me like, this is what I need to work out, and this is how I need to explain it, and this is, so to me this is gold.
Great. So I'm open. I mean, I want to hear if you come back like to the podcast, in 3 months or whenever, and say, hey, I got some answers. I would love to hear them, because I am open to anything that can be proven.
And right? I would just ask you as a friend, if you take the time, like in your next reading of Genesis, to try to take note of them and look for the parallels.
Oh, I absolutely will.
So if you do that and you say, okay, I mean, even in preparing for this today, going back over some of the other ones, I was like, man, there's like 20 that I missed, So like, there's lots of stuff that I didn't see that I just saw even looking at it last night. But I would be interested if the tables were turned and I was asking you like, okay, so look, the pattern's there, the chiasm's there, the parallelism's there. It has to be meaningful. Now, again, I would ask you, what is the meaning? What are we supposed to derive from this? If this is indeed true, and anybody listening, like, man, I would love your feedback on it, because it's captured me. It's fascinating to me. But,
do you have an email address you would like to share that people could?
My email address is just my name, Joshua Kennell, one word, @gmail.com.
And I'll put that on the. Well, I won't, because I don't want you to get a bunch of spam. So in order to get it, you would have to have listened this far. Okay. Yeah. So Joshua Kennell @gmail.com. Okay. So, and that's Kennell with 2 N's and 2 L's.
Yeah. Kennell.
Okay. So if you want to correspond with Josh on this issue and talk with him about that, that would be, I'm sure you're amenable to that.
Absolutely.
And Bethany wants you to finish the study.
She's juggling 4 children and 1 in the belly.
Like I say, I mean, when I read Genesis, I will obviously be looking at it that way, because you've got the ball of yarn in my head, and it's
gonna get messy.
Yeah, there's no other way. I'm gonna obviously be considering this, even if it's not front and center.
And I would say not only here, but like I said, I can find it in Exodus. I can find it in the Torah for sure. But I mean, I was going through 1 Samuel, and again, I found a dozen instances where.
Tell me an instance that you found that you said, oh, that's a connection, and then say, no, it's really not. It looks like one, but it isn't.
I mean, I'm not looking for no connections.
Well, that's a problem.
Well, here's what I'm saying. So, for instance, just one that I found, this week in reading. So, the Torah portions that you read, you go through them. We're reading one Leviticus called Shemini, and it's got Nadab and Abihu, and they're going into the Holy of Holies, and they're offering the strange fire. Then you get the same words, the take and the give, and the burning of incense is the same word as eating, like consumption, devouring. So you see all of these words. You see these 2 characters. They die. They get carried out of the camp in their clothes. They're dead. So it's kind of patterned after the Adam and Eve story. And the whole tabernacle is just a little microcosm of the universe. So it's after the creation of a little world, and then you have Nadab and Abihu, and that's happening. But for instance, when you're reading the Torah portions, you get what are called Haftorah portions, which is like a portion from the Torah, and then you read a portion from the prophets. And these are selected, and these are ancient, So these are, once again, parallel passages. And the Haftorah for this passage was out of the book of Samuel, and it has to do when David's bringing the ark back into Jerusalem, and you have Uzzah, and he's once again stretching out his hand, and he dies, and then you have David, and he's afraid because of this, and then all of a sudden he's dancing and he's naked, and so again, just themes that are really suggestive of, I think, the garden story told, once again, why do we have Samuel patterning this little narrative after the garden story? Does that make sense?
I understand what you're saying.
So for instance, I see it.
But my question is, do you have an example, or can you think of one where you think, oh no, I went too far? That's not. It looks like a pattern, but it isn't, because I have a methodology that says that can't be a pattern.
I mean, I don't know if I can answer this question. I don't.
Well, that's fine. I mean, I'm not gonna put you on the hot spot.
I could say
but you understand the point of the question.
There are like, for instance, I think like Numbers 25 and stuff.
No, the point of the question is that if you don't have any instance where you have overreach, then you don't have a methodology.
Yeah.
And what you're basically doing is you're gazing at clouds and you're finding any possible connection you can possibly make in your mind, and there's no way to prove that those are accurate.
I think
that's different. That's problematic.
I think what you're saying is possible, but if, for instance, it's true, right? On if this really is an important pattern that does get cycled into a lot of other narratives that are told, then if that's true, and I see it, then there's not anything wrong with it, right? I mean, that's also a possibility,
But it's only a possibility if there's some boundaries where you can establish there's overreach. Otherwise,
to me, it would be overreach if here's an example. There are some times when I'm making connections, and they're not direct verbal connections. I'm saying these ideas are equated, and I can see why they're equated. For instance, like I used the one, Noah awoke from his wine, right? And I said, okay, well, when somebody's asleep, their eyes are closed and then they're open.
There you go.
Is
that an overreach?
I would say this is a potential overreach.
Okay,
because
there you go.
It's not a clear verbal, like this is the same word as this.
I would agree. And I would include on those the ones where you say, well, this word, when you take out the vowelization, it has a sound like another word, and I'm like, this is an overreach, in my opinion.
But again, you'd have to know a little bit about Hebrew.
Fair enough. I'm just saying where I see.
Sure.
So I would say that seems to me to be an overreach. When you say, when we take this word and we spell it backwards, then it has a connection. I'm like, to me, that's an overreach.
Yeah.
It's like, I don't think so. The numerical value of this word is this, and then that's related to that because of this. I'm like, no, you're overreaching.
None of the points depend upon any of that.
I get what you're saying. I'm just saying that when you start doing that, you start finding that you have less and less and less connections when you stop overreaching. And then you have to reevaluate it on the ones that are really there. And my point to you is, as an objective criticism, is that I think you need to develop the methodology by which you're doing this, not finding more details. I think you're substituting finding details for developing a methodology by which you can say, this is how these connections can be made. I think you're just saying, if I can find 1,000,000 details, it can't be falsified, because they'd have to falsify it 1,000,000 times. And I'm telling you, I'm skipping to the end and saying, if you don't have a methodology, I basically don't accept it. That's what I'm saying.
Okay, I agree.
Because I would want to say, this is a methodology. If you take my methodology, you can prove me wrong.
Yeah.
Whereas if it's all the details you found, then you're saying you can't prove me wrong because they're my details. Yeah. And it's like, well, then no, right?
Okay.
All right. Well, very good. I think we had a great conversation. At least to me, it was.
It was fun.
I enjoyed it a lot. I really liked your study. Like I say, I want everyone to know. I mean, I really did. I enjoyed listening to it. I don't agree with a lot of it, That's why I like listening to it, and it made me think, and that's what I appreciate. And like I said, and
Well, that's
I
what I
mean
want to do. I just want people to think
Well,
about the
that's
Bible.
great.
I want people to appreciate the Bible as much as I appreciate the Bible. That's it.
I agree with that. And like I pointed out, I think that's one of the very positive things. And the other thing, and I mean this in all sincerity, I think you're a very gifted teacher, and I appreciate being able to be ministered to you in that capacity. I think you're very gifted, and I appreciate it. If you want to listen to Josh's study on Genesis, you can go to SoundCloud, and look up Joshua Kennell, all one word, Joshua Kennell. That's the channel, and it's on there. It's how many studies is it? 30?
I mean, I have a few different sermons, but Genesis I think is 18 teachings, something like
18 teachings of like between hour and a half and 3 hours, depending on the portion. And he goes through, and you can listen to it. And I would recommend you did. If you're interested in this subject, you should go and listen to him for yourself and see what you think about it. If you want to interact with us, you want to tell me how horrible I was to him.
He was great. Don't do it.
You can write me at podcast@freebornchurch.com. Podcast@freebornchurch.com anytime you want. This was a special day. Normally we do it on Saturdays, but we got a chance to do this one today on Sunday with Josh, and that's great. And we want to have you back in.
I'd love to be back.
And talk about some more stuff.
Sounds good.
And especially things we disagree. Every time I invite a guest on, they say, what are we going to talk about? And I say, anything we disagree on.
Yeah, it's entertaining.
I do not want to talk about something I agree on.
Yeah, rule of podcast.
No,
don't bore 'em.
yeah, that would be terribly boring for all of us. We'd all be laying here asleep like Nolan.
I keep saying that. I'm never asleep. I lean back on my chair once.
They're like,
and
oh,
he's
you're
like, "Yeah,
sleeping. I caught you sleeping. But yeah, we definitely will get you back on. We appreciate you coming out. We appreciate the work you're doing. And God bless you, brother.
Thank you, brother.
All right, take it easy.